it underneath it with a little bit of water.
I take it off, and I slip it into another.
Very smart.
It's underneath, it's still good too. That my son discovered 2 years ago. We tried all methods we tried. Full towels, paper towels, everything.
That worked.
And that
Okay, try it.
It's
But you have to keep it standing up. So
yeah, and I was just sticking out a little on the bottom underneath it.
Yeah.
Just the bottom of that, not
Right.
not the whole case.
Right. Zog Tahillig Mishnah. Hashoichet Eis HaZevach. So we're learning classic Pigul now. Hashoichet Eis HaZevach Lizroik Damai B'chutz. You shechted it with the kavana of chutz and koimai. The shechted or to spritz some of the blood. Chutz la'azara lahakter a mur b'chutz a miktas a mur b'chutz lechel b'sori b'chutz a kazais b'sori b'chutz.
What's the difference
between what and what?
With a little bit of a lot.
Well, that's going to be the chiddush that by Pigul, even if you did it on a small amount, it will still be mifagel, even though there's other meat that you could still be makir kol. Now here's where we have a little bit of a wild card. Or if you shechted almanas to eat from the orha al yibachutz. So we have a couple of questions that the Gemara is going to discuss. Is the hide around the tail, is that part of the tail? L'moshel, if the tail has to be brought on the mizbeach, do you also have to be makriv the hide or not? If you do, well, then this is really an emurin. And you have machshava to eat emurin b'chutz, like it's not normally Pigul will be you had kavanah to be matur de emurin b'chutz. So the question is, choshav b'Pigul lechal davar haniskater or vice versa. The Gemara is going to get into that question. B'chutz. Possible the aim by chorus. It's possible to do in chorus because this is the type of Pigul of chutzum koimoi, which although it's also to do, if the carbon becomes possible, but if you eat it, you'll not be chayiv kos. But if it's chutz l'zmanoi, such as lizuk dami l'machar, or miktas dami l'machar, or lahakta emurav l'machar, or miktas emurav l'machar, or lechel b'sari l'machar, or kazayis mi b'sari l'machar, or lechel kazayis mi or ha'alya l'machar, that's real Pigul, v'chiyav l'avkaris. So I call it main Pigul is chutz l'zmanoi, and baby Pigul is chutz l'mkoimoi. So Shol Ansfeld says Pigul and Piglet. Zog to Gemara weiter. Svarua, we're going to assume at first glance, or alya ka alya dami. The hide around alya is just like the alya, and therefore on some animals like a sheep, you're makrib that on the mizbeach, and therefore you have to be makrib the or as well. And even if you skinned it, you'd have to put the or on separately. Unlike all the other emurim, where you don't put the skin on the mizbeach, you skin the animal first. Freit to Gemara, so how could this be a machshava of Pigul? You're having kavana on something that you're supposed to be makar on the mizbeach to eat, and that's going to be a machshava of Pigul. Amashul, that's exactly the way it is. Hamani Rabbi Eliezer, it's actually a machloikus Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbanon, and our Mishnah is going to be going according to Rabbi Eliezer. The Amar machashvin me'achilas mizbeach l'achilas adam. Achilas adam achilas mizbeach. The Tanan we learned hashoichet es hazevach lechal davar she'ein dakir lechal or lahaktir davar she'ein dakir lahaktir kosher. The Rabbanon there's no psul Pigul there, but for Rabbi Eliezer paisel. Why? Because he holds mechashvin me'achila la'achila, and it will still be a problem of Pigul. Zok Gemara b'malkim the Rabbi Eliezer. So you're saying that the Mishnah that we just learned is good according to Rabbi Eliezer. The problem is the very next Mishnah in our Gemara, which is really one long Mishnah. Our Gemara just separates long Mishnayos to inject perish. So I must say, let's look at the very next Mishnah. Zaklal. Anyone who does any one of the four major avoiders. That's Pigul. We could be medayik. So you see, Klor, that's not going according to Rabbi Eliezer. It's also no Rabbanon. So, Frank the Gemara, Shmuel, are you telling me that Reisha Rabbi Eliezer b'Sefer Rabbanon? Amalei Shmuel said in. That's exactly what I'm saying. And if you look at the Tziyonim, they add in Reisha Rabbi Eliezer b'Sefer Rabbanon. So that is Shmuel Pshat. And their Mishnah. What's that? That's right. So we're gonna have two other perushim to the Mishnah. Rav Huna Amar or Alya Lavka Alyadam. So therefore, if you had to come on to eat or Alya, even though the Alya you were supposed to be Makavan Mizbeach, the or you don't have to be Makavan Mizbeach. So we circumvent the entire Shaila of Davar of Mechashvin Me'achilo Laktar or vice versa. It's the whole thing is not relevant because we're not speaking about something that you would put on the Mizbeach. We're speaking about the or. Amar of my time Rav Huna. Where did Rav Huna get it from? That the or of the Alya is not part of the Alya Lagabe being makriv on the Mizbeach, because it says in the pasuk Chel boya Alya. You know what you're supposed to be makriv? The chelev of the Alya, v'loy or Alya. So that was the second shot on the Mishnah, and you don't have to come on to the problem of Reisha Rabbi Eliezer v'Sefer Rabbanan because it's not negate the whole shayla. So then we do have a problem. You're assuming we're talking about the type of aliyah that you would have to be makriv mizbeach. Only of a sheep you have to, but of a goat you don't have to. And our Mishnah is speaking about a goat. Now it's going to be a little bit modern because that's like any other meat in the animal. Vosab is the Mishnah decided to specifically list the aliyah of dignity. So that the Gemara is going to behandle. Zog the Gemara, we have three pshatim, and each one of these three Amoraim disagreed with the other two. We want to know why. You know why Rav Chisda and Rav Huna both didn't like Shmuel's pshat? Because of the problem that the Gemara discovered. Reisha Rabbi Elazar v'Sefer Rabbanan. Loy mukmi. They didn't want to do that. Okay, so why does everybody disagree with Rav Huna, who says that or aliyah is not ka'aliyah dami? Because they disagree with the fact. Loy army or aliyah ka'aliyah dami. They don't hold that Kravuna loy army or aliyah ka'aliyah dami kamashmu. They disagree with Rav Huna. Rav Huna holds or aliyah is not ka'aliyah, but they hold or aliyah is ka'aliyah. So that's why they couldn't agree with Rav Huna. Rav Chisda, my time in Lamar. Rav Chisda had a pretty innocent pshat. It's speaking about a gedi. Zok to Gemara, my kamash v'lon. The problem, what's the chiddush? What is the chiddush that the or of the aliyah gedi, which is not one of the emor? So of course it's a davar shabachila. Zok to Gemara, maybe the chiddush is that or aliyah ka'aliyah dami. Maybe a gufa is the chiddush. Dafka by a gedi, do you say that it's not a davar shamaychol? But if it was of a kevesh, it would be something you have to be makriv on the mizbeach. And he also holds that ein mechashvin me'achilas adam la'achilas mizbeach, and therefore, the chiddush of the Mishnah is that gufa that or aliyah is ka'aliyah dami. Let's see Rashi. Ma'ika mashmalon tonu demasnisin. If we're talking about an aliyah shal bishal kevesh, bishlam. If you say we're talking about the aliyah of a kevesh. Kamash malon l'shmuel the mechashmin me'achilas adam l'mizbeach u'me'achilas mizbeach le'achilas adam krabelazar. Okay, according to Shmuel, our mission is a gavaltic chiddush because if you hold a krabelazar, you see that you're mechashav from achilas adam achilas mizbeach and vice versa. U'lerafuna the mukila krabana. Abuna learns ein mechashvin, but ashvin tandidan dar aliyah lav ka'aliyah dami laktiroi. There's also chiddush in our Mishnah that or aliyah is not ka'aliyah. You dash from the pasuk chelboy and not oirei. Elo Rav Chisda lamed l'masanya. Why b'chlal did the Tana even list this case? Ilash meaning the or aliyah in achilas adam ka'aliyah dami. If the Mishnah is trying to hint us that or aliyah in achilas adam is ka'aliyah dami, and you could eat it, and if you had in mind to eat it. It's as if you thought on the kazayis basar from the carbon to eat chut lizmanoi. Why? Because the aliyah is soft. So, or aliyah kaliyadami. Now, this or aliyah kaliyadami is not the same or aliyah kaliyadami that we were speaking about just a moment ago, right? A moment ago, we were saying that it's part of the emur and you'd have to be makriv. Now we're not saying that. Now we're saying or ayakal yadami means it's a new or ayakal yadami that it's soft enough that we consider just like meat. And if you ate the or, it's as if you ate the meat. So Dr. Tanina, that's also a brisa. Legabe tumen tahira, the brisa discusses, or the Mishnah actually discusses, is or considered basar, and would it be susceptible to tumas oichlin? and would it be susceptible to tumas nevela? And it says in the Mishnah, Lagabi tumas tahira, the elu she'oyrei saying kivsaram, and therefore they're like Michael or shataka sa'alya, the skin that's underneath the tail. So once again, what is the chiddush of the Mishnah according to Reb Chisda, who states that if you eat an alya, we consider it an achilas basar, and therefore the kavana to eating an alya chutz lizman will be pigul. Zok to Gemara, Istrich. I still need the Mishnah over here to tell us the halacha lagabi pigul, because from the halacha of tuma, I wouldn't know it. Yisol the chamina hanimidali in tuma. The rachich, since it's very soft skin and it can be eaten like soft meat, therefore mitzdarf we consider it a meichel lagabi tumas oichel. Aval hacha, it might be considered meat, but the Torah says that you give matnas kuna lemoshcha legedula, meaning it has to be a very respectable, aristocratic type of offering. No king is going to eat skin from where the sun don't shine, right? So Zok Gemara, emel lemoshcha legedula kederech shamalachem oichlin. You're not going to find a king that's going to eat this type of meat. So, there you say that or is not kabasar, and therefore, you would have thought that it's not considered kabasar, lagabe kachim, and therefore, if you had a machshava to eat it, it wouldn't be a machshava pigul. Kamash malon, no, it's considered a meichel, and therefore, if someone ate it with the das, if someone shechted with the das to eat that part, that is legit pigul. So now we went through all of the three explanations for our mission. May say the Gemara is going to ask a kasha. Now, what's uncanny here is that it should say a korban. Why is the Mishnah talking specifically about an oil? So Rashi tells us there's a very big difference between the oila and the other karbanos. All the other karbanos, the Torah tells us that we have to put certain meat on the mizbeach, we have to eat certain meat. Oila, the Torah just says, take all the pieces and throw it on the mizbeach. The Torah never identifies anything as meat. Anything gets thrown on the mizbeach. So it says, "Ashoycher is oila lahakter kezayis meor shetachas alya chostum kaimai." It will be possible by mekaris. Chutz money will be pigul b'chayavin a law of karis. Elazar ben Yehuda ish avelim aimer mishum Reb Yaakov b'chein Reb Shimon ben Yehuda ish kvar ichos. These are new tanaim that we I don't remember counting them. I'm not sure. It's a Mishnah talking. We're quoting a Mishnah. Aimer mishum Reb Shimon echad or base parshas behemedaka. The hide of the lower leg of the behemedaka is also very soft. The echad or haroish shall egel arach. The hide of the head of a soft calf, the echad or shetachas ba'alya, which is what we discussed, and any other type of or where in hilchos tumah v'tahira we say it has a din of oichel, the chol shemanu chachamim gabei tumah ve'elu sha'irei saying kivsaron, which is going to add one more type of or that will become pigul, lahavi or shal beis haboishes. That's the makam erva of a female animal. Even that is going to be considered meat lagabe hakrav. Chut l'mkami will be possible in bekaris. Chut l'zmami will be pigul v'chayav and alav karis. And what does the Mishnah say? Oila in aval zevach loy. So the question is, why is zevach loy? B'ishtam Rav Huna hainu dekatani oila, because according to Rav Huna, the or is not kibsarai. So therefore, only by an oila will you throw everything in the fire. El Reb Chisda, my area, the Tani Oila, lists the Zevach as well, because he holds its regular basar. Let's see Rashi. L'Rafuna davar behedya ma'atekra gabe alya didn't have a murin. He says beferish it's not a murin. Avol gabe oila lo yimit. The special pasuk that tells us v'schela if alya, that's not speaking by a oila. They're speaking by a Zevach, by a carbon that's eating. That's eaten. The chesed on Nesachim. By oil just says nesachim, but our alya basar, it is basar. Our alya is considered basar, so therefore we don't have a miyat. So only by oil would you say that the or of the alya would be included in what you put onto the mizbeach. But by zevach we know we have a miyat. So it makes perfect sense according to Rabuna. That's why our Mishnah Dafka said that Or Alya will be, if you have a machshava on it, or the machshava is Pigul, the Or Alya, it'll become Pigul. However, but according to Pchista, there's no difference between an Oila and a Zevach. Because if it's meat, it's a meat Lagabe a Zevach as well. I have two ways to find for why the Braisa says Oila. Maybe it's speaking about an Alya Shal Gedi. By an Alya Shal Gedi, it does it's something you don't put on the Mizbech at all when it comes to other Kabbalah. When it comes to an Alya Shal Gedi, you don't put on the Mizbech at all when it comes to other Kabbalah. It's only by an Oila. Just change the words and say that it says Zevach. This is where we're up to. So I just want to wait a couple of minutes till Moshe Rubin comes. Or we could start, and when he comes, we can go over again. I can afford to learn it multiple times and still not understand it properly. Okay. Zok to Gemara. Somebody asked me if I say karbonis these days, I'm learning karbonis. So I said, no. I'm slaughtering karbonis. I still have to say karbonis. Zok to Gemara Vayter. Pasul ba'im by kares. So the Mishnah says that if it was chutlam koimai, it's possible in makaris. So this is what we're focusing on now. We know Pigul of chutlam koimai is possible in makaris, but Pigul of chutlam zmano is yesh makaris. The Gemara is going to look for a makar for that, and the Gemara is going to have multiple amiroyim that offer different makaris, and then, as it usually gets in a complicated sugya, the Gemara wants to know what does each amar do with the other fellow's puzzle. So that's what we're going to be going through today. It's going to be a bit complex, and it's kedai to chap a chumash because unless you have a Torah or a shalom, so we should understand what's going on over here. So zog to Gemara, mino hanamili. How do we know that distinction? Zog to Gemara, Omar Shmuel Trey Kroisi. There's actually two psukim that we attribute to Pigul. One is in Tzav, and one is in Parshas Kedoshim. And let's look at the two psukim in the Torah or Hashalom. One is a longer version and one is a shorter version, and the Gemara is even going to refer to them as a longer version and a shorter version. So the longer version is in Parshas Tzav. V'im he'achol ye'achel mi b'sar zevach shlomo b'yom ha'shalishi lo ye'rotze ha'makar v'oisoi lo ye'choshev lo Pigul yeh v'nefesh oichelas mimenu avoynoi tisa. Now in Parshas Kedoshim, the pasuk says, "V'me'achel ye'achel b'yom ha'shlishi, Pigul lo ye'ratza," and the very next pasuk says that there's a Chayiv paris. Okay, so now that we have these two psukim, let's see how the Gemara learns from these two psukim these halachos. Amash motrei kroiksi mahi. What are the two psukim? Omar Rava. Let's go through and analyze them. Shlishi, when it says in the first pasuk, "V'me'achel ye'achel b'yom ha'shlishi," that's referring to chutz l'zmanoi. It's referring to the Pigul of chutz l'zmanoi, and that makes sense because shlishi means it's eaten out of the right time. Pigul, it says Pigul who? Pasuk says that when the Torah says those words in the pasuk zeu chutz l'mchem. Then the pasuk continues and says v'nefesh oichelas mimenu. So mimenu. Only we just discussed two types of Piguls: a Pigul of chutz l'zmanoi and the Pigul of chutz l'mchemoi. But only one of these two Piguls, echad v'lo shnayim, only one of these two Piguls will be avoid tisa, which we're going to learn from Nosar means Chayiv chorus. Zeu chut l'zmanoi, it's referring to chut l'zmanoi where there's a Chayiv chorus, u'l'mu'utay chutam kodim, and it's being memayit chutam kodim. Now let's look at the pasuk inside to see it again how it's laid out. That is chutz l'zmanai, we said, right? Lo yerotza makaboisoi, lo yechoshev Pigul yeh. That's referring to chutz l'mchemai. And right after chutz l'mchemai, what does it say? So even though the Chayiv chorus is mentioned right after the chutz l'mchemai, the Gemara is saying now that it's referring to the chutz l'zmanai. So, Frank the Gemara, why do you say that? Frank the Gemara, why do you say that? I lost the place. It's saying the Chayiv chorus on chutam koimai. Ulamuda chut l'zman. Zog to Gemara no. Mistavra chutz manoi odif. It's more mistavra to say that the Chayiv Kares is going on chutz manoi, the pasuk bay, because that is the soul with which the Torah introduced all parsha Pigul. Adarabba, chutz koimai odif the samachle. Chutz koimai is actually mentioned closer to the Avodah Tisa. Ela Amar Abaye, we have a problem, so we're going to rely on what Rebbe taught us. Ela Amar Abaye, Kiosar Bitak Bavdime Amar Rav, or what Rav taught us. Amar Rav Samach Adatani Tana. Rav was relying on the brisa that he learned. Kishoimer Shlishi Beparshas Kedoshim Tiu. The second time it says, it shouldn't have said that because we already know the parsha of Pigul. Sherek Far Nemar Vim Heyachel Yoyachel Mi Besar Zevach Shalom V'Yom Shlishi. We already have it in Parshas Tzav. So why is the Torah repeating it? Zok to Gemara. Since we don't need it, 1 second. Now, before we turn the page, we need to ask the obvious question. Maybe that pasuk is not speaking about Pigul. Maybe that's speaking about Nosar. If you eat Nosar on the third day, Pigul Ratza, and then there's a Chayiv Kares. How do you know B'chalal that this is referring to Pigul? So for that, we have to look at one Rashi all the way at the bottom line. Teneu chutzum kaim. Correct Rashi, what about eating it mamish? Maybe it's talking about eating Nosar. You can't say it's speaking if you mamish ate it. Because it says in that pasuk lo yerotza. Eating Nosar will never cause a carbon to become possible retroactively. So therefore, Moshe, whenever you're ready, we're going to go back to where we left off yesterday.
Okay, so let's go there now. I'm ready.
Okay. Pesach, Pasol Vein Mekaros. The Mishnah that we learned yesterday taught us the basics of Pigul. That a Pigul of Chutzlim Kaimai is possible, but if you ate that meat, there's no Chayiv Kares. And a Pigul of Chutzlim Manoi is possible, but if you ate that meat, you'll also be Chayiv Kares. So the Gemara today is going to share with us how we know the distinction between these two types of Piguls. That Dafka Chutzlim Manoi is Chayiv Kares, and not Chutzlim Kaimai. The Gemara is going to offer multiple approaches to this shaila, and everyone's going to use a diak from a different pasuk, and then the Gemara is going to know to top it all off to make the sugya fun what everyone does with everybody else's pasuk. So we're going to have a lot of fun today. Minahan amili. How do we know this halacha that chutzim kaimai is no chiv kares, chutzim manai is chiv kares? Amar Shmuel trei kroy ksivi. There's two psukim that discuss the halacha of Pigul, and before we start the Gemara, let's just review those two psukim. In Parshas Tzav, which the Gemara is going to refer to as Pigul Arichta, because that's the longer pasuk referring to Pigul. It says, "V'me'achel yeyachel mi besar zevach shloma b'yom hashlishi." The Gemara is going to tell us in just a moment that it's not referring to Nosar. He's talking about if you did any avodah, having in mind to eat chutz l'zmanoi. So that's the first Pigul chutz l'zmanoi lo yiratza markavoy shelo yichoshu. Pigul yiyah is referring to the Pigul of chutz l'mkoimoi. The Gemara is going to tell us, and the pasuk says what's halacha with these things. And we're soon going to learn that avodah tisa we have exer shava avodah tisa from Nosar and it means a Chayiv Kares. And the Gemara is going to discuss this Chayiv Kares. What part of the pasuk is it going on? Is it going on both? It is only going on Chut Zmamei, which is the first one mentioned in the pasuk, or is it only referring to Chutam Koimai, which is the Pigul that's closest to the Avodah Tisa? Now, there's another pasuk that the Gemara tells us is referring to Pigul, and that's a pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim, and there it says Vim Heyachel Yeyachel B'Yom Hashlishi Pigalu Lo Yeratza. That's also referring to Pigul, and the next pasuk says that it's Chayiv Kares. Now, the question that we just discussed in Rashi is, why would you say this is speaking about Pigul? Why not say it's speaking about Nosar? If you eat Nosar, you're Chayiv, and you're Chayiv Kares, like the next pasuk says. Zokt Rashi, this cannot possibly be speaking about Nosar, because it says if you eat Nosar, lo yerotze, the carbon will be possible. We know that's not true. If you bring a carbon and everything's perfect, you just happen not to eat the meat on time, the meat's nicer, but the carbon's kosher. So from the fact that the pasuk says lo yorotza, we know this is referring to Pigul. So now we have two psukim that are speaking about Pigul, and let's see how they interact with each other. So Zog to Gemara, Amar Shmuel Trey Kroiksi. There are two psukim that reference Pigul. Mahi Amarabba. The first pasuk is Shlishi, is referring to the Pigul as a chutz manoi. Pigul is referring to the Pigul of Zeh Chutzim Kaimoi. And then the pasuk says, the pasuk continues and says, Vanefesh ha'oichelas mimenu. Only if you eat one, not both of these. So how do we know that Sai Chutzim Manoi and Sai Chutzim Kaimoi don't get curries? Because it says va'oichelas mimenu. Only from one of the two. Now we just have to know which one. Echad v'lo shnayim. Zok to Gemara, Zehu, which one is it that you're chayiv kores for? Zehu chutz lizmanoi ulamute chutz l'mkoim. Correct, Gemara. How do you arrive at that conclusion? Ve'ema v'anefesh oichelos mimenu zehu chutz l'mkoimoi ulamute chutz lizmanoi. Zok to Gemara, I have a good reason for it. Mistavra chutz lizmanoi odif. You know why chutz lizmanoi should be the more severe pigul, the one that comes with a chayiv kores? Is the pasuk bay. When the Torah introduced it with Chuslas Manoi. Frank Gemara Adarabba. I have another argument to say that it's Chuslam Koimoi that should get cars. Because Chuslam Koimoi Adav to Samachlei. That's right near Avoy Netisa. So which way do you go? Elamar Abaya ki Otzer Rabitak Bar Abdime Amar Rav Samich Adatanitan. Rav was Samich on the following brisa to get clarity that the Chi of cars is only if you eat Pigul Chutz Manoi. Kishu Shlishi the Parashas Kedoshim Tiyu. We have the second parasha of Pigul in Kedoshim, which is completely redundant. Shein Talmud Omer, we don't need it. Sharei Kfar Nemar v'Me'achal Yochel Mipsar Zevach Shlomo b'Yom Shlishi. We already have the parasha of Nosar in Parashas Tzav. Why do we need the parasha of Pigul? We already have the parasha of Pigul in Parashas Tzav. Why do we need a second parasha of Pigul in Parashas Kedoshim? Zok the Heilige Braise. This is our favorite technique to be used in Kochim. We don't need it to tell us about the Pigul of Chutz Manoi because we already know it. Teneu inyan Chutz Limkoimoi, and say it's referring to Chutz Limkoimoi. Now, once we say that the Pigul in Parshas Kedoshim is referring to Chutz Limkoimoi, I already know it can't be Chayiv Koros. You know why? Because the very next pasuk says, by Nosar, it says, V'oichlov avoyno yisa ki es kodesh Hashem chilel v'nichris ha'nefesh himayamel. Mitrach monag by Nosar v'oichlov. Only if you eat Nosar, avoyno yisa. Lemute chutz l'mkoimoi. The pasuk right before speaking about chutz l'mkoimoi, the next pasuk is speaking about Nosar and says v'oichlov avoyno yisa. Dafke, if you ate this Nosar, but not if you ate the Isser of Chutz Koimoi, as mentioned in the pasuk prior. Break the Gemara, you're assuming that Va'ichlov in the next pasuk is referring to Nosar. It doesn't say anywhere in this pasuk of Va'ichlov the word Nosar. It's just Va'ichlov Avayna Yisa. So break the Gemara, Ve'ema Va'ichlov Avayna Yisa Chutz Koimoi. Maybe Adarabba. Maybe you have arrived from this pasuk that the Pigul of Chutz Koimoi comes with the Chayiv Koros. And to tell us that if you the dafka chutz koimoi has a chiv koros, but not Nosar. Zok to Gemara mistavra Nosar haba leila ukme b'koros. It makes more sense that Nosar should get koros and not Pigul of chutz koimoi. And here's where it's going to get a little funny because it's going to sound like circular logic, but it's not. Lemigmar avoin lechutz lizmanoi. In the parasha of Chayiv Koros in Kedoshim, it says va'oichlav avoino yisa, and we know we have Gzera Shava avoinoi to the parasha of Pigul in Parashas Tzav. Now, if it's referring to chutz l'mkoimoi, then we have a problem because we know that only one of the two Piguls in Parashas Tzav comes with the penalty of Koros. Because it says menu avoid yisa. Can't be both. So therefore, if the pasuk of avoid yisa is going chutz koimoi, well then you'll have avoid sai chutz koimoi, sai chutz manoi is chayiv koros. We know that's not the case because it says menu. So it must be that avoid yisa is going on Nosar, and we learn avoid just like avoid by Nosar is chayiv koros. So to avoid by chutz lizmano is chayiv kares, and chutz l'mkoimo is not chayiv kares. Yesterday we were looking, we don't know where they're hiding, all those machamaris. They must be all upstairs, but we were struggling to find them yesterday. I don't know, someone slaughtered all of those macham gemaras. I don't know. I know I slaughter the Gemara every day. And those who come to me are sacrificing.
Yeah.
So to Gemara. The Ema Eichel of Avoni Yisa Zechutz from Kaimai Ulumutei Noiser Mikaris. So you can't say that because Mistaver and Noiser Havale Lukme Mikaris. Why? Because we have the Avon Avon Lemigver Avon Avon Lechutz Lizmanoi. Now, the question is, why B'dafka do we want to compare Nosar to Chutz from Kaimai? Why don't we actually say that Sai Chutz from Kaimai and is Chayiv Kares, and let's use Avodah Avodah. The Mimena will worry about a different time. But why can't we do that? Zok Gemara, because the Domi lay Bizayin Beis. Nosar has a similarity to Chutz L'Zmanoi, while Chutz L'Zmanoi does not have a similarity to Chutz L'Mchaimai. What is the similarity that Nosar has to Chutz L'Zmanoi? To them. One is Zayin, Zman. They're both time related. Chutz L'Zmanoi means you had Kavanah to eat or to be makir or to be zoyrek out of the right time. Nosar is also eating out of the right time. And Beis means it's noigeya by bomos. By bomos you can have a pigul of chutz manoi, but you can't have a pigul of chutz kaimai by bomos. You know why? Because there's no makaimai. There's no makaimai. So therefore we see a distinct similarity between Nosar and chutz manoi. So therefore that's how we want to make the Gzera Shava. Zok to Gemara, Adarabba, Chutz Kaimai Havale Lukme Bekaris. We should say that the pasuk in Kedoshim, which talks about Vaychlev Avoni Yisa, is referring to Chutz Kaimai, and you could learn from Chutz Kaimai to Chutz Manoi because Chutz Kaimai shares a lot in common with Chutz Manoi. Havale Lukme Bekaris Lemigmar Avoi Nova in the Chutz Manoi the Dameloi B'Mem Kuf Dalid Shin. So we're back in the deadlock. How do we know that the Chayiv Kares mentioned in Kedoshim is referring to Nosar? Maybe it's referring to the Pigul of Chutz L'Mchaimai. Okay, now let's see what the Mem Kuf Daled Shein is. Zokt Rashi. I want to learn the Rashi inside, but I'm going to just quickly mention Mem is Machshava, Psai Chutz L'Zmanoi and Chutz L'Mchaimai. The Psul is B'Machshava, right? Kuf is Ksas. Both Chutz L'Zman and Chutz L'Mchaimai, we already learned in the Mishnah. Even if you only had kavanah to do part of the dam Chutz L'Mchaimai or part of the dam Chutz L'Zmanai or the basar, it's enough to passel. Dalet is dam and is applies to Zrika, and Shein is Shlishi Chutz L'Zmanai. Now the problem is why do we need this similarity? The only time the Gemara ever brings up you should compare it to this because it has similarities, right? Well, what is my alternative? What else would you have learned it from? We're trying to learn the Chayiv Kares from Avoinoi, from Nosar where there's a Chayiv Kares, or from maybe Chutz L'Mchaimai where there be a Chayiv Kares. Why do we need to show their similarities? That's because there is a competing Avoinoi that does not come with the Chayiv Kares. So let's have a look at Rashi. You're better off saying that in Parshas Kedoshim, the pasuk of Ha'ochel Avoni Yisa that talks about a Chayiv Kares is referring to Nosar. Why? Lemigmar Avon Avon L'Chutz L'Zmanoi, because we'll be able to learn the Chayiv Kares through the word Avon Avon to the Isra of Chutz L'Zmanoi, which is mentioned in Parshas Tzav, the Domelei B'Zayin Beis. Fragt Gemara Adarabba Chutz L'Mchaimai Havale L'Ukmei B'Kares, the Migmar Avon Avon L'Chutz L'Zmanoi, the Domelei B'Mikdash. So let's tell on the pasuk in Kedoshim where there's a Chayiv Kares is referring to Chutz L'Mchaimai, and Chutz L'Mchaimai will learn to Chutz L'Zmanoi that is a Chayiv Kares. Zokt Rashi v'Achi Prush Nosar Havale L'Ukmei B'Kares. You know why we want to say that the Parsha of Ha'ochel Avoni Yisa in Kedoshim is referring to Nosar? The Migmar Avon Shetilamed Shemalamed Kares L'Chutz L'Zmanoi. That is our makor that there is a Chayiv Kares of Chutz L'Zmanoi. She'ein Kares Mefurish Boy. It doesn't say anywhere in the pasuk in Tzav Mefurish the words of Kares. Even if Ha'ochel Avoni Yisa in the first pasuk or what's the lashon pasuk? Vaychol he says avoino. It says v'nefesh oichelas minu avoino tisa. Even if we want to say that avoino tisa is referring to chutz manoi, but it doesn't say anywhere what avoino tisa means. Shein kares mufurish boy el nesius avoino amur boy. The limed mikan we're learning from Nosar from v'oichel avoino isa where it says v'nichrisa the gzeres shava. So just like Vaychel Avoin Isa by Nosar in Parshas Kedoshim is referring to courage, because the pasuk says v'nichresh over there. So too when it says by Pigul, the nefesh ha'cheles min avoin tisa, it also means courage. Hilchach, therefore, imukmas lei lahai kares. If you say that the courage in Parshas Kedoshim is referring to Nosar, then it's a gevaltik gzer shava. Ikal amilfil gzer shava shapir. The damu ahadadi b'shnei dvar malol, because Nosar has some similarities with chutz manai, and that is man, that is bama. Shtei b'shalom b'zman, zeh b'zman mamish as Nosar, zeh b'machshavas man pigul, u'shneim lehagin b'bama, and both of them apply to a bama. Kidetam b'perek basra, like we learned in the last pasuk that they're both neged by a bama. So therefore, the chiparchis, if you're going to ask. V'neilef oven mitumas basar. It says oven. Yes, it's a gzershav oven. But who said you should pick the oven by Nosar, where the Torah talks about a chiv misa, chiv karis? Maybe we should learn oven from tumas basar. Tichsev also v'nosa aharon as avoina kadishim. And over there, if you eat katzim betuma, malahalan lav v'loy karis. There is no isa karis. Avkan lav v'loy karis. So that is our question. What, you know why we need some normally for Xeris Shava? Why do you need similarities for it? Right, that jumps right out at us. We have Xeris Shava. By Xeris Shava, we don't need similarities. You need similarities to point to you where to darshan the Xeris Shava. We need to know to darshan the Xeris Shava not from Tuma, but rather from Nosar. Why the Damalei Bizayin Beis Bisman and Bibama. If you're going to say that the chorus of Parshas Kedoshim is referring to Chustam Koimai and not Nosar, so then you're going to have to learn Chustam Manai from Chustam Koimai. Ki garmis lei Chustam Manai minei b'gzer shava uparchinolei will ask the same question. Why learn Avoinai from Chustam Koimai? Learn Avoinai from Tuma and don't learn a Chayiv chorus. V'nei of Avon the Tuma. Luckily, the truth is we're not going to be able to have a teretz. Mi chuslam koimai have a little mail to dummy bezayin base. Because by chuslam koimai you don't have zayin base. Da ain't psule bizman. Ve ain't yonaim gabamish yachid. She ain't shamachitzos. Dr. Gemara ain't chanami. But you know what? We have other similarities between chuslam zman and chuslam koimai that are not shared by tuma, which is machshava, kitzas, dam, and shlishi. And now the Rashi details it. Chuslam zman and chuslam koimai, both piguls have a fabulous connection. Shneim psul b'machshava. They're both possible b'machshava. Tuma is not possible b'machshava. If only one part of the animal became tummy, if one piece became tummy and it's not connected to the rest of the pieces, the other parts won't become tummy. Ushneim nifsalin ba'avodas hadam. Side by pigul and side by while you're being makir adam, it can become possible. Uvishneim nemar shlishi, and it says the word shlishi by both of them. It says B'yom HaShlishi in Parshas Tzav, and it says B'yom HaShlishi in Parshas Kedosh. Lafukei Tuma. Tuma doesn't have these same characteristics. A, ain't possible by Machshava. B, B'yom Nitma Maktsosai Loi Nitma Kuloi. C, V'yeshna La'achesh Rikas Damen. We know Pigul, after you did this Rika, you cannot become Pigul anymore. But Tuma can be forever. V'loi Nemar Shlishi Yisera, and in the Parsha of Tuma, it doesn't mention the word Shlishi. We have a very good similarity. Shlishi mi Yosy l'gzer shava delil. The b'chol chad mina yuksiv ma'noisha b'yam ha'shlishi b'eishisarif. By both these psukim, Sayin Tzav, Sayin Kedoshim, it says b'yam ha'shlishi. V'samach leivim he'achel ye'achel v'leiboy l'michtav shlishi. It didn't need to say shlishi again, so they have another similarity. So therefore, we're back to square one. How do you know that chustam koimai is not Chayiv Karis, and Nosar is Chayiv Karis? Maybe it's exactly the opposite. So we need to find another Makara. Zog to Gemara, I'm going to tell you how we know that. Ela Omer B'Yochanan, we need now help. we're calling in reinforcements. Tani Zavdi Bar Levi. Zavdi Bar Levi was a Tana who, or I'm not sure if Zavdi was a Tana or if he was in the Murray who's quoting a Brisa. Asya Kodesh Kodesh. Let me see if he says if this gentleman was I'm sorry? What did he say?
Rashi switches the names around.
Oh, so what did Rashi call him?
Levi
was out there. So I'm not sure if that's a Tana or an Amor, but whatever it is, along with Yochanan, Tani Levi was out there. Asi Kodesh Kodesh. We have a Gzer Shava from the word Kodesh to the word Kodesh. Ksiv Hacha. It says here in the pasuk, and I'm going to look in the Bach. It says Ki Es. Let's look at the Aleph. This is the Chayiv Kares in Parshas Kedoshim. Ki Es Kodesh Hashem Chila. So it says the word Kodesh when it's talking about the Chayiv Kares in Kedoshim, V'nichasa, and then it says Ksiv Hasam V'saraftas HaNoiser Be'esh. It says V'mivaser Mipsar HaMelumim Melechem Araboger V'saraftas HaNoiser Be'esh Lo Yeyachal Ki Kodeshu. So from Kodesh Kodesh, we see that the pasuk of Eichel Yisa is not talking about a pigul of Chutzim Kaimai. It's got to be talking about a pigul, a psul of Nosar. Malala Nosar, just like the pasuk in Shemois is referring to Nosar. When it says Ki Kodeshu, Afkan Nosar, so too when the Torah talks about a Chayiv Kares for eating this, it's referring to Nosar because it says Kodesh. And Umiyat Rachamana Gabi Nosar, V'Eichlav Avoyna Yisa. And by Nosar, going back to what we said before, it says by Chlav, Dafk if you eat Nosar, will there be a Chayiv Kares? To tell us that Chutzlim Koimai, which is the pigul that we were talking about a moment earlier, the Friedrich Apostle does not have a Chayiv Kares. Pray to Gemara, Umay Chazis, the Kra Aricha B'Chutlas Manoi. Why are you assuming that the pasuk in Tzav, which we call the Kra Aricha, the longer pasuk, is talking about Chutlas Manoi? Ushlishi the Parshas Kedoshim Tiyu is referring to Chutlam Koimai. Maybe the pasuk in Kedoshim is speaking about Chutlas Manoi, and the pasuk in Tav is Chutlam Koimai, and maybe it's Chutlas Manoi that doesn't have chorus, and Chutlam Koimai does have chorus. Flip it around, and Rashi says, flip it around. The Eimod Aricha b'Chutlam Koimai, Uksiv ben Nesias Avon, Ushlishi the Kedoshim ti Chutlas Manoi, V'Eimod the chorus. Say punkt verkehrt. Zog to Gemara, you cannot say that. Why? Because Mistavra Aricha b'Chutlas Manoi. It makes more sense to say that the parsha in Tzav, the long parsha, is referring to Chutlas Manoi. Why? The Gomar Avon Minoisar the Domile Bezayin Beis. We're going right back there again. Frek the Gemara Adarabba Aricha b'Chutlam Kaimoi Ushlishi the Kedoshim Tiyu should be b'Chutlas Manoi Mishum the Domile, because it's doima to it. Why is it doima to it? I'm sorry, I didn't read this good. And for the Gemara, you can't do that. Why? Because mishum the domile samche v'kamamaitle. Because it's doima to it, that's why it's nearby it. To tell us bedafka that it's not chayiv kares. What does this mean? Zogt Rashi, Mistava Aricha b'Chutlas Manoi, the Kivin de Parish Be Kares Behedya. It doesn't say that there's a Chayiv Kares Mufurish by the Pigul of Chutlas Manoi. Ella, B'Gzer Shava, the Oven Minoiser. It's only because we have a Gzer Shava of Oven Minoiser. That was a whole makar that we have for the Chayiv Kares by the Psul of Chutlas Manoi. Therefore, Mistavra the dummy mididami yala. We should learn similar things out of each other. The dummy bezayin base. Zman and Bama are similarities between Chutlas Manoi and Nosar. The Mukmas le b'Chutlam Kaimai, if you're going to shtel ein, the first pasuk by Chutlam Kaimai, Su lo yalev kares minoisar, you won't be able to learn kares from Nosar. The loydami lebemidi, because there's no comparison between chutz l'koimei and Nosar. Fragt the Gemara, Adarabba, mistaber mishum de domi leichutz l'zmani l'Nosar, samche l'Nosar. Adarabba, if you're telling me that Nosar is so similar to chutz l'zmanoi, so place Nosar near chutz l'zmanoi, which means, say the second pasuk in Kedoshim is referring to chutz l'zmanoi. Here, you made the whole argument that since it's similar, you want to use the Gzer Shava for it. Since it's so similar, put it near it. And therefore, the kamamayit le'ma'oichlov, and you'll be mamayit for ba'oichlov, dafke Nosar. Dafke Nosar has kares, and that's manai. The kamamayit le'ma'oichlov, the loitema mishum the dam nigma minei. So maybe that's exactly what we're trying to do. Maybe your whole assumption is wrong. Maybe chutz l'zmanoi is not chayiv kares. And Vibalt, it's similar to Nosar. The Torah placed it near Nosar. Why did the Torah want to place chutz l'zmanoi, which is similar to Nosar, near Nosar? Because the Torah B'dafka wanted to tell you, also vision that Pigul of chutz l'zmanoi does not get curse. And that's why B'dafka is placed there. And maybe the Avoin Avoin will teach us that the Pigul of chutz l'koimei gets curse. So we're back to square one. How do we know that the Avoin Avoin of Nosar is teaching the Pigul of chutz l'zmanoi is chayiv kares and not chutz l'koimei? I could make a really good argument that the avoin avoin, which is the Gzer Shava between Nosar and the first parsha of Pigul, is between Nosar and Pigul of chutz l'koimei, and chutz l'zmanoi, the Torah b'dafka placed right near Nosar because they're similar b'zayin beis, to tell us that dafka Nosar gets kares and not chutz l'zmanoi. So we went through our full Amud, and we're right back where we started from. El Amarava, Kulu Mikra Aricha Asya. We're no longer using two psukim and bouncing off two psukim like Shmuel told us to do, because we tried all the different methods and we didn't come up with a clear conclusion. So therefore, let's stick to the main pasuk, the Mikra Aricha, the pasuk in Tzav. And you'll be able to know Sai Pigul of chutz l'zmanoi, Sai Pigul of chutz l'koimei, and Sai Dalacha that Dafka chutz l'zmanoi gets kares and not chutz l'koimei. Let's see how Rava pulls this off. Elam Rava Kulu Mikra Aricha Asya. Dichsiv. It says in the pasuk Heyachel Yeyachel. Right? It says Ve'im Heyachel Yeyachel. We darshan right away Bishtei Achilos Hakosef Medaber. The Torah is talking about two achilos. Now, a lot of the limudim that we're about to uncover are not relative or related to our problem. Only at the end, when we go through the whole pasuk in detail, will we extract the information we're looking for. So now we got to take a deep breath, open up our minds, because we're going to learn now some new things. Which tells us that what does Pigul apply to? It applies to something that has both an achilas adam and achilas mizbeach. If you have something that only has an achilas mizbeach, Pigul will not apply to it. Let's have a look at Rashi, where Rashi elaborates on this. Zogt Rashi, echad achilas adam, the loy shna chishav lecha l'machar, loy shna chishav l'hakte murim l'machar, Pigul. Oh, so I'm wrong. It doesn't make a difference if the Pigul is on the achilas adam or if the Pigul is on the achilas hamizbeach. So I wrongly touched. It has to be something that has both. That's wrong. It doesn't have to have both. Like an oil doesn't have both. But what we're saying is the psul of Pigul could apply. Say if you thought to eat basar, say if you thought to be makar v'emurim, that's one place where Pigul could apply. Let's look at the next word of the pasuk. Mibsar Zevach Shlomo. Those are the next word in the pasuk. What do we learn from Mibsar Zevach Shlomo? We learn that Pigul has to be similar to a carbon Shlomo. The entire parsha of Pigul is actually taught to us by the Torah in the sugi of the carbon Shlomo. Ma Shlomim mifaglin umispaglin. Just like a Shlomim has in it components that are mifagel, like the four avoidus, that's where you could make Pigul. Umispaglin, and there are meat. There's meat and dam that becomes possible by Pigul. Avko mifaglin umispaglin. So this is what I mistakenly was referring to earlier. So avko sheyeh. So let's look. Besides Zevach Shlomo, Rashi on the second wide line. Hikish Zevachim l'Shlomim. All karbonis where Pigul applies have a similarity to Shlomim. Ma Shlomim yesh ben mifaglin, v'yesh ben mispaglin. Shadam hu amifagel, v'abotzor ve'emurin are the mispaglin. Af kol sheyesh ben mifaglin u'mispaglin, Pigul noyeg boy. So what are we excluding? Here we're saying Yotzam Minchas Kayanim or Minchas Kohen Mishiach or Minchas Nesachim Shehein Matirin Es Atzman Ve'ein Ben Shirayim Lis Pagel. There, the whole thing is put onto the Mizbeach. There is no part that you're makriv and Shirayim. Pigul means there are krava. Whenever you're doing the process of the carbon, it makes the Shirayim also. But here, there's no Shirayim in these kravos. So therefore, Shehein Pigul Noyeg Ben. So these types of Karbonis don't have Pigul. Pigul only applies to Karbonis where there's something that's a matir and there's something that becomes mutter. But if nothing ever becomes mutter, then there's no din Pigul. Okay, Shlishi. What do you learn from Shlishi? Because it says that's talking about the Pigul of Chutz L'zman. Lo Yerotzeh. What does Lo Yerotzeh tell us? It tells us Kartzas kosher kein artzas pasuk. What does that mean? That means in order for it to be Pigul, it has to be a pristine carbon that had it not been for the Pigul, it would have been a completely kosher carbon. Kosher, just like the basar won't become kosher to eat until all of the material and the carbon was executed properly, so too afartos pasal it will not become Pigul achi akrivu kol matira. Let's see Rashi, because I don't trust myself to mefarish it. Zog to Gemara, ma hartzaras aloye rotze, mashma, zog to Beis, mashma, the azrika kai, referring to the zrika, loy tehei zrika zumarat, shmamina, the achi yizur kadam, machshavas Pigul tluya by meves. It will not become Pigul until we finish the zrika, meaning we have completed all of the avoidus behechsher. Nizuk Adam, if the dam is nizuk behechsher, so now it's a pristine carbon besides for that machshava, then hukva Pigul, then it becomes Pigul. But noy nizuk Adam, what if you were not able to complete the avodah properly? Going to nishbach, botla Pigul, it's not going to be Pigul. Dichsiv behartza, dichsiv gabe kosher. Matar is kosher like karle hartza. The carbon is not nisratze. Ela bezrika shu soif arba avodas hamatiros. You have to do the avodas properly. Af Pigul einoi kavua achi yizur kadam shu soif kol matir. Okay, that's another halacha that we knew about Pigul. Now we're seeing how it's extracted from the pasuk, and then it says the next word in the pasuk is hamakrib. We're literally dissecting this pasuk word by word. So it says lo yarotah, then it says hamakrib oisai. So here's beautiful hamakrib ba'krava hu nifsal. The einoi nifsal b'shlishi. You know when it becomes possible ba'akrava during the avodah, the avodah of the zrika. If you do the avodah of the zrika with a machshava of chutz l'zmanoi, that's the machshava. That's the psul of Pigul. Ve'einoi nifsal b'shlishi. But Nosar is not what it is. It's dafka a machshava Pigul during the zrika, not a psul that comes afterwards because you didn't eat it on time. Let's have a look at Rashi. Ba'akrava nifsal. Hashtayal, you know what we're learning over here now? We're learning the bipsul machshava hakosef medaber. How do we know that we're talking about psul machshava? Maybe we're talking about psul noiser. Telling us that the psul is shemechashiv b'shas hakrava lo'ichle b'lishisi, ve'inisa b'shlishi. Im ba'krava lo'ichishev amunaske. What if you didn't have a b'chshava Pigul during that krava? But v'acham imenu b'shlishi, but you just ate the shirayim. And now carbon nifsalim. Eating Nosar doesn't pass the carbon retroactively. As far as we mentioned earlier. The Achim Midrash, lo yeratze hamakriv. The makriv will not be meratze, meaning lo says rikase meratze, the zrika of this carbon that you had a machshavas Pigul on, its zrika will not be meratze imal manas kenekrivoi. But if you ate the carbon out of bounds, but everything else was done good, that is not a psul Pigul. And now the last one is oisai, hamakriv oisai. We learned oisai is talking about the carbon. Oisai, bezevach hakosef medaber. You know what becomes possible if there's a machshava Pigul? The carbon. The einoi medaber b'koin. You would have thought that maybe the coin becomes possible. If a coin is a machshava Pigul, now he's a possible coin. because it says a makriv. The kohen is known as makriv. So it says oisai. Now the problem is makriv oisai doesn't change anything. The person who is makriv it. How do you see from there? It's not talking about the person. That rather talking about the meat. The teretz is it's extra. Could have said a makrivai. A makriv oisai means the word oisai is extra. Oisai, the piece of meat. That's what we're talking about. That's what becomes us. Okay. The pasuk goes on. Every word we're extracting the max out of every word. This is like a Rosh Hashiva shir. Every syllable of Medayik. Lo yechashev. What does it mean? Lo yechashev. It won't be considered. Zok the Gemara weiter means lo yarayv boy machshavos acheres. What does that mean? That means if you had two machshavos that would passel, it's ois pigul. It's ois pigul. Just like if any avoider was done passel, it's ois pigul. So too, if you had a different machshava that would passel it, it would be ois pigul. Now, what other machshavas could you possibly have that passel a carbon? As far as I know, the only machshava that passes a carbon is either chus l'zman or chus l'koymai. Zokt Rashi, we're talking about if you had a machshava chus l'zmanoi and then you had a machshava chus l'koymai, it's no longer a chiyav karhes because the machshava of chus l'koymai messed it up. Zokt Rashi lo yarb by machshavas acheres mikan l'machshava shematzi zumizu. One machshava is enough to mess up the pristine cut of the carbon that is no longer subject to the chiyuv of chorus. Shemachshavas psul moitzim de pigul. Zok the Gemara lo yarba machshavas acheres, and then it says lo yechashav loy pigul yia. Right. So pigul zeh chutz l'mkoymai. Pigul is referring to the machshava of chutz l'mkoymai that could be a machshava that will make it ois pigul. Yia, this pigul yia. So Rashi says also nakos of the chutzum koimai or the chutzum zmanai havai achas. Melamed shemistarfen zemzeh, meaning Rashi says, what if I had kavana to eat one half a zayis chutzum zmanai and another half a zayis chutzum koimai? Would that be pigul? It would be pigul. It would only be pigul that doesn't have a chi of chorus, but it would be pigul. So yia we learn shemistarfen zemzeh. The pasuk goes weiter about nefesh oichelos mimenu. That we were like earlier already. Echad v'lishnayim. You're only chayiv karish for one of the two piguls, not both. Now we're getting to what we were looking for. Now we're hovering in. We're getting warmer. So we've just learned from the pasuk that only one of the two piguls, if you eat it as a chayiv karish, and now is the punchline. Which one is it? Will the real pigul please rise? Ve'ezeh hot lizmanoi. Why? The Gomar Avoin mi Nosar the Domile Bizayin Beis. Zokt Rashi, the Domile Bizayin Beis. Veloy, let's look at the Aleph. Veloy Shavkinon Lechutz Lizmanoi the Domile Nosar. If we're going to compare something to Nosar, we're going to compare Chutz Lizmanoi to Nosar. The Ostrik Zer Shava Minei. Because we can learn Xer Shava from it. That we're not going to let go of that, and instead put in its place Chustum Koimoi, like we've been asking all along. This is the question that we're trying to answer. So Rashi telling us we're not going to put Chustum Koimoi in place of Chustum Zmanoi to learn a Chiv Kars from Nosar. V'nigmar Chustum Koimoi. You know why? Deloidami leNosar b'midi. The Mikdash is a similarity between Chustum Koimoi and Chustum Zmanoi. But between Chutzlam, Koimei, and Nosar, there's no similarity at all. Frek the Gemara, Frek Rashi, why did we have to go through all this? Why didn't Rabbah say this before we had to abort his sugya? We could have still stuck with the two psukim and just said that you don't compare Chutzlam Koimei to Nosar. V'od l'shanya Rabbah b'reish ma'itzachi, keep karchinin, and we asked, Adarab Chutzlam Koimei Odev to Samachlei, you know why? Mishum dakati lekama le'gzer shava the Tana Levi bar Zabdi the corresponding. Because at that point we didn't even confirm yet that va'oichlav avoyna yisa is referring to Nosar. At that point va'oichlav avoyna yisa we were still saying it might be applying to the pigul of chustum kaimai. Only after that were we introduced with the gzer shava of kodesh that tells us that the pasuk of va'oichlav avoyna yisa is referring to Nosar. And now that we know for sure it's referring to Nosar, now if we're looking for something to compare to Nosar, because of our Avoin, clearly we're going to compare chutz l'zmanoi to Nosar because it has a similarity of Zayin Beis, and we're not going to compare chutz l'mklemet to Nosar. The name of the Nesius Oven, the Gabi Machshava, v'didami l'Nosar mishtoi. It's speaking about the type of pigul that's most similar to Nosar, hoil umina gamar. And therefore, the pasuk immediately preceding Nosar, Abayam Shlishi, is going to apply to chutz l'mklemet. And it's saying Dafka Oichalov Avoyna Yisa, Dafka, the one who eats Nosar, not the one who eats the pigul of chutz l'mklemet. But chutz l'zmanoi pigul of an Nosar is going to be Chayiv Kares. Gewaltig. What Rashi just told us is we really don't need this new brisa of Zavda by Levi, because we don't need this new brisa of who said that we learned it all from one place. Rava. We could really go back to Rabbah. Now that we know Kadosh, that was really the kingpin, that was the linchpin, that was the inch. We could really go back to learning from Tupsu. But Lamaisa, Rava opened our eyes up how much you can extract, how much information you can extract from one pasuk by being medayik in every word and every expression. Kavalti. Zog to Gemara Vayter. Amalei Rapapala Rav. Now that we got everybody's positions, now we want to know what everybody else does with everybody else's psukim. So Amalei Rapapala Rava, Lididach, according to you, where the Shlishi of Parshas Kedoshim you don't need at all. Because from Parshas Chav we learned everything we need to know about Pigul. So therefore, Shlishi the Parshas Kedoshim to you, my darshas, but what are you going to use it for? Dr. Gemara, Hahumi Bayle, Lamakaim Shiyeh Mishulush, Bedam, Bebasar Uveimurin. Chutz Limkaimai only works in a place that has Dam Basar and Emurim, which is Chutz La'azara. Let's see Rashi. Shiyeh Mishulish, the limit al machshavas chutz l'mkaimai, chutz l'mkaimai does not work unless you had kavanah to eat it outside of the azara. Sheinamai elas ela oy bekachim kachim, shechizav aleim loichlem chutz la'azara, oy bekachim kalim loichlem chutz la'ir. Prat l'mechashev, let me see the base over here, lo'oichlon behechel. What if you had kavanah to eat it in the hechel? The hechel is not a place where you eat kachim. Zok Rashi, not so simple. Prat l'mechashvan l'oichlon behechel the lav pasulu the ba'inon shechishav amakam al shalosh. So if you ate in the hechel, if you had kavanah to eat it in the hechel, it would not pass the korban. It would not pass the korban. It's not mishulish. It's not mishulish. Zogt the Gemara weiter. Sheyeh mishulish bedam bebasu veimurin. Zogt Rashi, the next Rashi. This is a very interesting Rashi. Bedam bebasu veimurin, a place where you can eat both. Hainu chutz lazara b'shas heter abomis. Where were you able to eat chutz lazara? All of these things dam bebasu veimurin, not eat, but be makav dam bebasu veimurin. That would be b'shas heter abomis. Lafucha heichal she'ein bo yaktar seimurin v'lo yachilas basar. Now, there's no aktar seimurin, true. But Toysus brings a raya that there is achilas basar. So Toysus asks a kasha not on Rashi's pshat. Rashi's pshat makes sense, but the fact that Rashi stuck in that you cannot eat basar kachim in the heichal, that's what Toysus argues on. You could see there's a long Toysus, but Toysus just mentions, he quotes Rashi, and then he says uvezeloi duk. The first skinny line of Toysus is uvezeloi duk. The contrary is the achilas basar matzi mishachas beheichal. You could have a scenario where you would eat basar in hechel. We're going to see on daf samach vav, I think. She'im ekifu goyim eskala azara. What if they were being surrounded by the goyim? The kohanim had to run and hide. Shakohanim nichnasen behechel va'oichlin sham kachi kachi. So you see that it's not accurate. There are some specific cases where the kohanim would be able to eat kachi kachim there. That's just a very interesting factoid. Zog to Gemara weiter. So now we got the lesson of the pasuk of Shlishi Bashkadoshim to tell us what chutz is. Legabe chutz l'mkaimai. Frank to Gemara, typically mikra kama. Why don't we learn that same thing from the krakama? It says, "Imei achel ye achel b'da abkei rachmana b'loshen shlishi." So if you look at Rashi, so it says shlishi. So Omer Ravashi, Amrisa lo shmaitza kameder of masna, On Amalei, he told me, and there's those take out Amalei, if you only had the shlishi of Parshas Tzav, not the extra one in Parshas Kedoshim, Hava Mina shlishi is prat, Pigul is klal, because the pasuk by us is structured literally. And then there's Pigul year. So I would have thought that shlishi is a prat and Pigul is a klal. V'nasa klal moisav ala prat these Rabbi Shar Mekoimis, and I would have been marba any other places as well. There would be a psul of chutz limkoimot, and therefore, we needed dafke the b'shlishi where there's no product klal by the sugya of Pigul in Parshas Kedoshim to tell us that dafka out of the Azara kamashmal. Okay, what do you think the Shar Mekoimis would have been included? What other Mekoimis could there be? Where there would be a chutz limkoimot. Just wonder where would those other places be?
And when what are you talking about? Before the base of Mikdash was born, it was made. In the Bamos, when you had the Mishkan.
No, by the Bamos we learned there's no such thing as chutz limkoimot.
Okay, how about by the Mishkan?
By the Bamos there's no such thing as mekoimot.
How about the Mishkan?
By the Mishkan there was. There was a chutz limkoimot for kodesh kachim, but not for kachim kalam, because anybody around the Mishkan could eat. So I'm not sure what other places we're talking about. Let me see if he brings it. If he certain places. Oh, here he says. He says in the Hechel, but the Hechel doesn't work. So let's see if he says other places. Maybe he brings other places. I don't know. I don't know where those places would be. Second. Okay, so it's talking about by kachim we don't have a solution. He quotes from who is he quoting from? From the Michas Avram. He quotes from the Michas Avram for kachim we don't have a solution. But for kachim kalim, eating it in the eichel, we only have a record that kachim can be eaten in the eichel, but not kachim kalim. So the other places would be eating it in the eichel for kachim kalim. So there, if you had kavanah to eat kachim kalim in the hechel, it wouldn't be pigul because the hechel is not a mokam ha'mashulish. Zok t'gemar writer. Tanu Rabbana. V'im heyachel yechel mibsar zevach shalomov. Again, that is the parsha of Pigul in Parshas Tzav, the one that we call the long one. Omar Beliezer, koif oznachal l'shmaya. I think what I have to say is very worth your while. Bend your ear over and listen to what I have to say. This pasuk is b'mechashiv lechel mizivchoi v'yoyim ha'shlishi ha'kosem v'daber. It's not speaking about Nosar. It's speaking about Pigul thinking about eating it out of the right time. That's what it's referring to. Maybe the pasuk is actually talking about Nosar, not Pigul. Omrit acher shu kosher. If it's kosher already, because you already did all of the avodas, and now because you eat meat a day later, yachzer v'yifso. It's not logical. It's the third time we have the svara. It's not logical to say that retroactively eating the meat later should pass. Amalei Rabbi Kiva, I don't know why you think that's such an unusual thing. I'll show you retroactive psulim. Hein matzinu, didn't we find v'zav v'zava v'shemeresh yoyim k'neged yoyim? You have a zav and a zava who's in the middle of shiva nekiyim, right? So the halacha is they're naki while they're counting their shiva nekiyim. But if they end up being social to shiva nekiyim, they're all tama again. Shein becheskes tahira, but v'chivin shiro saser it soiser all of the days from before. Zokt Rashi explains v'zav v'zava shepasku they stopped seeing their ears v'schinu limnois yemei sipurim Umanu Dalid, or Hey Yamim, they're already 4 or 5 into the Shiva Nikiyim. I'm going to start over again. Ve'im Ro Sasu Kominyanam. And if they see Dam, it destroys the whole thing and they got to go back to square one. So you see this concept, or even by Shemer Shem Kiyag Yoim. Haroy Hoich Echados Yoim to Benidal Nida. The Tavla Lamacher, right? So the halacha is she sees Dam Nida one day, she has to keep, she will tell the next day, she'll be Torah right away. And then if she sees Dam again, she's Tomei. So there she's Torah a whole day. And what happens was if she sees Dam later, retroactively, she becomes Tomei. So you see this concept. So why don't you say that retroactively, if you eat Nosar, it passes the carbon? Avat al tatam al zeh, shava bisha hochsher, sheyachsher v'yivso. Amar lei. So he answered the Rabbi Kiva, who was talking to Rabbi Lozer, told Rabbi Kiva back. Oh, shkoich, yeah, I love that. Amar lei, he told him, Hareyu oimer, we have a pasuk. It says in the pasuk, hamakriv. Right? What is in the pasuk? Lo yerotzeh hamakriv oisai. B'shas hakrava hu nifsal. We have this already. Ve'ini nifsal l'shlishi. Hamakriv, during that krava, meaning this rika, up until the end of this rika, can you passel the carbon? After you made this rika, you can no longer passel the carbon at all, ever. So therefore, so Pigul won't be chal afterwards. That means you can't be talking about something that's going to pass the carbon afterwards, meaning by eating the meat till too late. Oy einoi oimer hamakriv elazeh koyin hamakriv. Maybe hamakriv doesn't mean to tell you the makriv, meaning the avoida of akrava, referring to the zrika, like we're saying. Maybe like the having we had before. Maybe a makriv is referring to the person who's makriv, and it's telling you that if you have Nosar, because we want to now argue that the pasuk is not talking about Pigul, talking about Nosar, which is a psul that happens later. If you have Nosar, the coin becomes possible, right? Which is mamish shver to think. Because some Yisrael ate his meat too late, the coin who worked on the carbon should be possible. Maybe elazeh koin hamakriv. It says oisai bezevachim medaber bein medaber b'koin. Like we said earlier, oisai is extra. Could have said a makrivoi. A makriv oisai means we're talking about the meat. Gewaltig. Okay, so now we've confirmed that we're talking about Pigul, not Nosar, like Rabbi Lozer told us. Maybe you should say it does possible retroactively. For that we say no, because it says a makriv oisai to tell us that the meat, the krava creates the full, meaning this rika can't become possible because it was eaten too late. Okay, Ben Azai is another pshat. Mat oisai mat hamad loimer. Why does it say oisai for? It says loisa acher l'shalmon. Now, why are we asking Ben Azai? Why is Ben Azai? Do we have Ben Azai yet today? We do not have Ben Azai. Okay, Ben Azai oisai. It says oisai. What do we use oisai for? Matamad loimer. Levishanemer loisa acher l'shalmon. There's another place where it uses the word oisai. But Isra Bal Ta'acher. The halacha is if you promise a carbon, you have to bring it within 3 regalim, right? We know that Aveir. So Yochel Af Ma'acher Nidre Below Yerotze. I would have thought that if someone brings a carbon too late, it will not be Meratze. It says Kisider Neder Lashem Alekecha Leisachel Leshalmoi, and maybe if you bring a carbon too late, maybe the carbon will be possible. Talmud Loimer Oisai. Only the Isser of Pigul, the psul of Pigul creates a lo yerotza. The eina ma'acher nidroi below yerotza. So that's what Ben Azai learns out of this halacha. I'm starting again.
But he's here already. Moti learned before?
No, Moti's coming now. Moti's on his way. He's just preparing coffees. Okay, zog to more weiter. 1 second. I just want to look up one thing. I can't see everything. Evolve. So it's very important over here. Okay, weiter. Sagt mal weiter. Benazir learns from Oysa, you learn that if you a carbon that's Baal Tacher is not going to be possible. Acherim say, so we have a third shot, Lo Yechoshev, B'machshava Hu Nifsal, Veni Nistal B'shlishi, which is the sfor we had earlier. Frank Gemar Uben Azai, the Bezevach HaKosov V'daber Veni B'koy Minole. If you remember, we said Oysa is used to tell you that the meat is possible, not the kohen. But he's using Oysa to tell me, Oysa, what's possible is Pigul and not Baal Ta'acher. So how is he going to know that the kohen doesn't become possible when there's a machshava of psul? Minole. Iboy say Medafkale Midi Acherim. He can learn it from Acherim. How does Acherim know it? Acherim says Lo Yechoshe V'machshava Hu Nifsal. So Rashi says Midi Itzrich Kro L'Meimar. Since the pasuk has to tell us Ve'enoi Nifsal B'shlishi, the pasuk telling us that it doesn't become possible with Nosar. It only becomes possible through a machshava. Shemami no bezevach hakosim medaber. We must be talking about the carbon. Divi zayveach. If you're talking about the zaveach, you have a svara. Lama yivsal b'shlishi. Why should the kohen be possible? Because 3 days later, someone ate the carbon. Okay, would it be okay with you if we go back to where we left off yesterday? Because we need a chazar anyway. It's very complicated, this Gemara. So at least you and me will understand the Gemara when we're done. There's no Gemara. Because what happened was is my shear, I slaughtered so many Zevachim, it's kafela. You're sacrificing, I'm slaughtering the Zevachim.
Yes, we're finished for today for the 8:45.
No. But we have a whole bunch of people joining us, and I want to get to the bottom of Chav Tesam and Beis, which is past the Mishnah. So I have to pause back. So can I say WhatsApp you when I get back to moving forward?
Yeah, it wouldn't be till later on this afternoon, but anyway, we'll see.
But basically, all I'm doing is I'm going to have a 15-minute delay because to get from where we left off to right over here, it shouldn't take us more than 15 minutes.
So you're going back now?
Yeah, because everyone came in. Or you know what? Do you mind waiting 10 minutes till I finish the Omen base? Okay, that means yes. What? Okay, so you know what? Okay, so let's finish off the blot, and we'll be fine. Zok to Gemara, v'bayisema. So either nafkele me'acherim, Ben Azai knows that it can't be the kind that's possible because it's absolutely ludicrous to suggest that because someone ate Nosar 3 days later, it should possible the kohen who 3 days earlier did the avoid on the carbon. V'bayisema midachasov lo yeiratzeh. Lo yeiratzeh clearly is not talking about the kohen. Lo yeiratzeh is clearly talking about the carbon. V'lo yeiratzeh is zivchum. Uben Azai, Oisoi, V'lo yeiratzeh, and but Ben Azai, if Bibai said me d'chsev lo yeiratzeh, and lo yeiratzeh zivchum. Uben Azai, Oisoi, V'lo yeiratzeh. Ben Azai darshins, Oisoi V'lo yeiratzeh. You know which carbon is possible? A carbon that was Pigul. Ve'ein macher nidroi V'lo yeiratzeh. Frank Gemara, is this how Ben Azai knows that a carbon that you're over Baal Ta'acher on, that's the carbon that's not possible? You know it from this pasuk of Oysa in Pigul, Mehacha Nafka, Midacherim Nafka. Acherim taught us how we know it. The Tanya Acherim Oimim, Yochel Yehei Bechar, She'ibrish Nosai. You would have thought that if a Bechar is waiting around so long, that now it's past the year old, you might have thought that it should be possible to bring. It's Kapsule Magdashim, V'yafasal, and now you can't bring the carbon anymore. Talmud Loimar, it says a pasuk that's makish bechar to meiser. V'chaltel of Hashem Elokecha meiser degoncha. It says meiser degoncha tiroshki terechel uvecharis bekarcha. So we compare makish bechar lemeiser. Ma meiser ain't in nifsol mishad lachavita. Just like meiser, you could bring meiser from 1 year to the next. How do we know? Because we know every 3 years there's beer meisers. So you could see you can leave it over 1 year to the next. Bechar ain't in nifsol mishad lachavita. Zok to Gemara Itzrach. I still need 2 psukim to tell you that Baal Ta'acher doesn't create a psul in the carbon. Maybe Dafka Bechar, the La Bahar Tzohu. The Bechar is not being Maratza on the owner. The Bechar means the Torah says you got to give it to me. But it's not a carbon to do anything for you. If you missed the boat, Kamash Malom. Frank Gemara, we have a third Bechar for the halacha that Baal Ta'acher will not pass on the carbon. We learned it from V'hoyu b'chachet. It says in the pasuk, if you're Kisidi Ned L'Shem L'Kecha L'Sachar L'Shalmoi Kidarshi L'Shem L'Shem L'Kecha Milach V'hoyu b'chachet V'loy b'karban chachet. You have an aveira, but your carbon is no problem at all. Zok Gemara, that we learned already something else. So Kimmel of Azai, and you know what he taught us from this stat? If you're late on bringing a carbon, your wife's life is not in danger. Why would I think your wife's life is in danger? Because you're bringing a carbon? So Gemara is talking about the Chamina, Hayel Bama Rabbi Nosar. If someone owes money and he's not paying up, or made a promise and he's not fulfilling it, so someone who doesn't fulfill his promises, his wife dies because of that. Why should you take your bed, referring to your wife? So the Baal Ta'achar Nami Mesa, you would have thought that you could lose your wife for Baal Ta'achar. Kamashla, no. If you eventually pay up, you won't lose your wife. And everyone knows the famous story with the guy who was trying to get rid of his wife, and the Rav gave him an eitzah to make a big donation. We'll talk about that later because I don't want to hold him up. The psul of the pasuk is discussing is a psul of machshava, like a machshava of pigul, vein nifsal b'shlishi. But Nosar is not what we're talking about here, and the carbon will never become possible just because some of its meat became Nosar. Frank Gemara, Rabbi Eliezer lo yechashev my avidlei. Rabbi Eliezer, what is he going to use the lo yechashev for? Because Rabbi Eliezer knows that we're referring to Pigul and not Nosar. He knows it from a different pasuk. What did Rabbi Eliezer tell us? Rabbi Eliezer knew it from. Rabbi Eliezer says, "Kaif oizen l'shmoya b'machashav lechol mizivchay b'yamishlisha kasum davar oy ein ela b'oichel mizivchay." And so he said, "Amrit achar shukasha yachshav yifsol." He said either it's from a svara. So what does he need lo yachashav for? What's he going to use that pasuk for? Zok Gemara, he used it to teach us Rabbi Yanai's halacha. No, Rabbi Yanai minay lemachshavos shemotziyos zumizu. How do you know that if you have two machshavos, one will mess up the other, like we learned earlier? If you have a machshava chutz zman and chutz koymai, that it won't be chayiv kars. Shenemer lo yichashev lo yaroi boy machshavos acheres. Rav Mori Masni, Rav Mori learned the following. How do you know you got malchus? How do you know that if you make pigul, you get malchus? You learn the time. Rav Mori, how could you get malchus for doing an aveir that doesn't have a ma'ase involved with it? Lav shem b'maisu, v'chalav shem b'maisu loikin lav. Amalei Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda the lav shem b'maisu loikin alav. No lav shem b'maisu loikin alav. So it's gewaltig.
Yes, let's stop here. The rest of the Yom is just a Mishnah.
Right. So let's learn the Mishnah. Zakla. Here's the rule, which we actually had quoted already a couple of times. Zakla. Kol ha'shoichet b'makabel b'mahalach v'azor. The four avoidus. That's where you can do pigul. What was the kavana? Lechol davar shadakir lechol, laktir davar shadakir laktir, kizayis, hustum koimai, pasol be'bekaris, chutazmanai, pigul v'chayav in the lakaris, uvavachi yakir v'amatik mitzvasai, only if the carbon is completed properly. Ketzat kar v'amatik mitzvasai. What does it mean the carbon was completed properly? Either shachat v'shtika, you made the shchita without opening up your big mouth and having a machshavas pigul, because all these machshavas of pigul that possible have to be articulated with your mouth. And then kibul v'halach v'zark chutz l'zmanoi, oy sheshachat chutz l'zmanoi, v'kibul v'halach v'zark b'shtika, oy sheshachat v'kibul v'halach v'zark chutz l'zmanoi, zahu shemakriv hamatek mitzvasei. There, everything was done properly besides his kavanos. Ketzad loy karv hamatek mitzvasei. What's an example of when the carbon was not completed properly? Shachat chutz l'mkoimoi, and then kibul v'halach v'zark chutz l'zmanoi. So you already shachat chutz l'mkoimoi. So therefore, the whole thing is messed up. So there's a psul that came later. If you had both, so then both psulim are there. That's not considered pigul that's chayiv parts. Those are also possible karbanis. So therefore, if you shech it with a machshavas pigul, it won't be pigul. The kibul v'alach v'zark chutz zmanai, or sheshachat chutz zmanai, and kibul v'alach v'zark shaloi l'shman, or sheshachat the kibul v'alach v'zark daman shaloi l'shman, zeu shaloi kar v'matik mitzvah. So it just means something else went wrong. How about lechal kezayis b'chutz, kezayis l'machar, or kezayis l'machar kezayis bechutz, or kechatzi zayis bechutz, kechatzi zayis l'mochar, or kechatzi zayis l'mochar, kechatzi zayis bechutz, that's possible the ein by kares. That will be possible, but there's no in kares because you don't have a full kezayis of chutz l'zmanoi, or even if you did have, you had some chutz l'mklaimei there, which is a machshava that messes it up. Or maybe the zaklal kol shemachshavas hazman kodma l'machshavas hamakim. If the machshava of pigul of chutz l'zmanoi came first, and then only later on you had a machshava of pigul of chutz l'mklaimei, then it would be pigul b'chayav and love kares. But if the machshavas hamakot but if first the carbon became possible through a pigul of chutzum kaimai, then it can no longer become pigul of chutzum zmanoi, possible by cars. But the Chum argue it doesn't matter if it happened before or after. If the carbon is not completed to perfection, there is no chi of cars for pigul. Zev is a possible by cars. How about lechal kechati zayis and lahakti kechati kezayis basar? So there it's kosher. I'm sorry. What if I only had kavana of pigul of a chatzizais lahakter and chatzizais lechol, which are two different things? There it's kosher. That's not pigul at all. She'ein achila v'aktar mitzvah. Achila nektar not mitzvah. Okay, but not achila nektar. Okay, Gavaltik. So the next blot that we're going to learn, which is lamed, is Simchas Torah's blot. No, it's not. It's Shmini Torah's blot is Hoshana Rabbah, and Simchas Torah will be Shmini Torah's. Okay, let's go back to the drawing board. We finished off at the bottom of Chav Tes Amid Aleph yesterday. Chav Ches Amid Aleph. Right. Pasal Veimakars. Okay, so we are. I made up. I'm going to start this year after the Vasica minion, and the second time after the 8 o'clock minion. But I didn't realize that the 8 o'clock minion would finish so fast.
So this is the second year?
This is the second time. Yeah.
I checked.
So I'll know a little bit better because I was making a whole bunch of mistakes. Oh, okay. Zok Tehillah Gemara. It's better now. I know it a little. And now I know it a little bit. I don't know Megantin, but I know more than I knew before.
By the way, tomorrow's schedule is not what it says on the schedule.
Oh, of course. I know how I know because it's on the schedule.
The Sigma minion is 650. Doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense. Sure.
Yeah, that makes
Because
because it's a long
So we have to
Zimmer.
stay long to the Zimmer. So what time is
It's about 15 minutes earlier.
About 7:02.
Right, it would be 7:05. They made it 15 minutes earlier.
Yeah, tomorrow we're going to play the Vasican app. Everyone, there's a new game in the good. It's called the Vasican app. Everybody comes to Vasican, plays the app. They put it on their phone to the whole
You
production.
don't even have to. They have this big countdown and it blows up at the end when it's 0.
Yeah, so it's like going to like a virtual golfing range. You have it over there in front of you. Okay, Gavaltic. But the 7 o'clock minion will probably finish a half hour before the Vasican.
No, it's not
2
division.
million.
Oh, it said 7 o'clock.
They can't, yeah.
Oh, they were Mavato.
Find your phone, they're Mavato. Yeah.
I'm on downstairs.
It's 650 and 8
8
o'clock.
o'clock.
Okay.
And you have it downstairs.
So we're going to learn after the 6:50 minion.
Well, I mean, the,
I'm sure.
Oh, there is one that he said there. Did he say what time it's going?
Okay.
Yeah.
Dr. Gemara.
2 and 12 to the secret.
Correct. Puzzle the ain boy chorus. Puzzle the ain boy chorus. So we learned about the two species of piglet.
You know, Dominic 6:45.
One was a machshava of shaloi bizmanoi, which leads to a chi of chorus if you eat the meat, and the other one was a machshava of chutzlam kaimoi, where although it passes the carbon, if you eat the meat, there's no chi of chorus. Now the Gemara today is going to be very confusing because the Gemara is going to know, how do you know about these two types? How do you know that they exist? How do you know that this one gets chorus and this one doesn't? And there's going to be a lot of opinions of how we know it. And when you ever have a lot of opinions of how we learn something, we end up with a lot of extra psukim. And then the Gemara is going, no, what does everybody else do? Everybody else is possible. So it's one of those days. It's going to be one of those days. Zok to Gemara. Minohanamili. How do you know these halachas that we just discussed?
Pigul?
A pigul, yeah. Zok to Gemara. Amar Shmuel Trey Kroik Sibi. There are actually two psukim that refer to pigul. One is in Parshas Tzav, which you're going to see the Gemara is going to call the long pasuk, and one is in Parshas Kedoshim, which the Gemara is going to call the short pasuk. So before we get to the Gemara, I want to learn the psukim the way the Gemara learns them, so that we can glide through the Gemara. So the first pasuk in Parshas Tzav is V'mhei achel yeachel. Mi Bisar Zevach Shlomov. We already know that the whole Parsha of Pigul was introduced in the Parsha of Shlomim. Mi Bisar Zevach Shlomov. That sounds a little bit like not Nosar, doesn't it? Lo Yerotze. It's not Maratza. Hamakriv Oisoi. Lo Yechashev Loi. It won't be counted for the Makriv, whatever that means. Pigul Yia, it's Pigul. Va'nefesh Oichelas Himenu Avoy Neitisa. And whoever eats it will be Avoy Neitisa. What does Avoy Neitisa mean? So now let's go through the pasuk as to how we learned this pasuk. I'm going to read it through. Very basic. The Gemara is going to have a lot of variations, but just to open our minds up a little bit to how we're going to dash this pasuk. Ve'imei yachel yachel mi besar zevach shlomov b'yoyim hashlishi. That's referring to pigul of chutz l'zmanoi. So you didn't actually eat it chutz l'zmanoi. You thought to eat it chutz l'zmanoi. Lo yerotzeh. Some on the Amr are going to say from lo yerotzeh, you know it can't be referring to Nosar, because there's no such svara to say that if you finish being marketed the carbon perfectly, and because Nosar was left over, that's going to retroactively pass on the carbon. So lo yerotzeh tells you that it must be that we're talking about a machshava pigul, and then hamakriv is also a makor that we're going to see applies to what we're looking for, because hamakriv means hamakriv is the final part of the akrava, which is the zrika sadam. It's the final avoida. So the psul could only happen lo yerotzeh hamakriv. Only up to the akrava can a psul occur in the carbon. It cannot occur later on. So that's another way how someone learned that it will that this pasuk has to be referring to pigul and not Nosar. Hamakriv oisoi, there's going to be a having to say that the makriv is the coin. Maybe the coin becomes puzzle if it's pigul or Nosar. So the Gemara is going to say hamakriv oisoi tells you that dafka the meat is what we're discussing becoming puzzle. The coin who is involved in pigul does not become puzzle. We also learned from Benazai, which you guys were here for. Oisoi might also tell you that what type of carbon is puzzle? A carbon of pigul, but not a carbon that you brought too late, a carbon of baltacher. Lo yechashev loy, pigul yia. This, the Gemara is going to tell us, is applying to the pigul of chutz l'kaimai. V'nefesh haichelas min avoy netisa. We'll see in a minute. V'nefesh haichelas min menu. One of these two piguls will have the oynish avoy netisa. Avoy netisa, we're going to learn from Nosar that it means a Chayiv Karis, and only one of these two have a Chayiv Karis. Which one? That's also going to be part of the discussion of the Gemara. Now, there's another pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim that has similar wording, which is also referring to pigul. Vim heyachol yeyachel b'yom hashlishi pigul hu lo yerotzeh, and this pasuk has a pasuk that follows it that says the oichlov avoyno yisa ki es kodesh Hashem chilel v'nichrisa nefesh himeyavel. So we say that oichlov avoyno yisa is referring to Nosar. By Nosar it says avoyno yisa and there's a Chayiv Karis. So too the avoyno yisa that we have in the Parsha of Pigul is a Chayiv Karis. Now we just got to figure out which one of the two Piguls does it apply to. So that's what we're going to be going through today. Okay, Gavaldik. So now let's start the Gemara. Amar Rabbah. We have two psukim. Amar Shmuel, Trei Kroiksidi. We have two psukim discussing the Parsha of Pigul, and when we delve into understanding what each of these two psukim represent, our facts will come out. Mahi, Amar Rabbah, Shlishi. It says, Shlishi, that tells us that we're talking about a Pigul of Chut L'Zmanoi. Pigul, which it says later in the pasuk, that's referring to the Pigul of Chut L'Zmanoi. The pasuk continues, one of these pigels, echad v'leishnayim. So which of these two pigels is the pasuk referring to when it says avoy netisa? Zog to Gemara, zeu chut lizmanoi. It's probably referring to chut lizmanoi. Ulamute chutum koimoi, and chutum koimoi does not have avoy netisa. Frank to Gemara, who said? Maybe flip it around. The aim of anevesh oichelas menu zeu chutum koimoi. Ulamute chut lizmanoi. Zog to Gemara, no. Mistavra chut lizmanoi odin. It makes more sense that the unique, the special pigul that we're talking about that has the avoyna isa is chutz l'zmanoi. You know why? The pasuk pay. Because when the Torah introduces the parsha of Pigul, the first type of Pigul that was introduced to us was the Pigul of Chutz Zman. So that's the flagship Pigul. That's the Pigul that's going to get kares. In fact, more adarabah. Maybe Chustum Koymayodif, the Samachle. Which Pigul is closest to the which Pigul is closest to the Vahnefesh Oicheles Menu? Chustum Koymay. So maybe that should get kares. Ella Amar Abaye, Ki also Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Avdimai. When Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Avdimai said, Amar Rav Samach Adatani Tana. Rav got his information from what a Tana taught him. But he learned from a Tana, and this is what he learned. So now we're introducing a new limud, and this new limud, the purpose of it is to tell us that the Chayiv Kares is by Chutz Zmanai of Pigul, not by Chutzum Koyim. Kishu Oimer Shlishi Bepashas Kedoshim Tiyu. Now we're introducing the second parsha of Pigul in Kedoshim, and we already read the pasuk, right? It says V'meyachal Yachal B'yom Shlishi Pigulu Lo Yeratze Shein Talmud Loimer. We don't need the pasuk to tell us another parsha of Pigul. We already learned Parshas Pigul in Parshas Tzav. It says in our parsha of Tzav, so before we turn over the Omid, we need to ask a question. Did you ever think that maybe it's talking about Nosar? Maybe it's talking about Nosar. Oh, so Rashi it says Lo Yeratze. Lo Yeratze wouldn't pass the Karban, like we said earlier. That's why I threw out these factoids. Okay, it wouldn't pass the Karban. So therefore, it has to be speaking about Pigul. Okay, so Zog to Gemara Viter. This is the favorite limud in Kachim. We don't need the second parsha of Pigul in Kedoshim to tell us about Chutz Zmanoi, because we already know Chutz Zmanoi. Teneu Inyan Chutz Koymai. Let's say it applies to Chutz Koymai. You might ask, we had some remes to Chutz Koymai in the first pasuk. Because the Torah wants to tell us something important about Chutz Koymai, that it doesn't get kares. Right after this pasuk of Pigul of Chutz Koymai, the next pasuk is V'oichlav Avoyna Yisa, which is talking about Nosar. So the fact that the Torah wanted to place the parsha of Chutz Koymai right near Nosar, and by Nosar say V'oichlav Avoyna Yisa, to tell us V'oichlav, Davka, the person who eats Nosar Avoyna Yisa, Lamute Chutz Koymai. So I know what Mati's thinking. Who said V'oichlav Avoyna Yisa is going on Nosar? Maybe V'oichlav Avoyna Yisa is also going on Chutz Koymai. So Frank the Gemara, Ve'ema V'oichlav Avoyna Yisa Zehu Chutz Koymai Ulamute Nosar Mikaris. Maybe Adrabah. Yoichlav, only one of the discussion here is going to be Chayiv Kares. Who said it's Nosar? Maybe it's actually Chutz Koymai. And if you would do that, it would turn everything around. Because now you have the Avoyna Yisa referring to Chutz Koymai, and now Chutz Koymai will be Chayiv Kares, and from Avoyna you would learn that Chutz Zmanai is also Chayiv Kares. So they will both be Chayiv Kares. So I don't know what you're going to do with the word Mimenu, because Mimenu only one is Chayiv Kares. So, I'm sorry? It wouldn't be Chayiv Kares. That's right. Zok the Gemara, Mistavra Nosar Havalel Ukmei Bikaris. It would make more sense that Nosar is the one that has kares. You know why? Because we already said that from the pasuk of kares, there's a gzer shav of avon to chutz l'zmanoi, and we need Nosar to teach the chutz l'zmanoi lemigmer avon the chutz l'zmanoi the zomelei b'zayin beis. Now this sounds like a little circular logic here, right? Because I want to call this Nosar because it's easier to learn from Nosar to chutz l'zmanoi. Now, what Rashi explains to us is, when you make a Gzer Shava, does it have to be Domile? There's no such thing as Domile by Gzer Shava. Gzer Shava works no matter what. The problem is, there's an issue with this Gzer Shava. It does say, avoid the Yisa by Nosar or by Chutz L'Payim, whatever that pasuk is talking about, and there's a Chayiv Kares. But guess what? There's another avoid the Yisa by another parsha, by the parsha of Kachim that's Tomei. And by the parsha of Kachim that's Tomei, there is no Chayiv Kares. So I could ask Akasha, you want to learn Avon, who's that to learn Avon from V'oichlav Avoyna Yisa v'nichasa? Maybe learn Avon from Kachim that became Tomei, where there's only a lav. So on that, the Gemara would have to answer, it's more mistaber to compare Chutz L'Zmanoi to Nosar, because it shares two similarities with Nosar. Zman, they're both time related. Nosar, you actually ate at Chutz L'Zmanoi, and Pigul of Chutz Zmanoi, you had a machshav of Chutz Zmanoi. And Beis is Bama. they're both noyeg by a bama. You can have chut l'zmanoi by a bama, and you can have noiser by a bama. But I don't think tumah had tumah by a bama. I'm not sure. So therefore, it would make more sense that the v'oichel v'onis is referring to noiser, because that will make it possible to learn to chut l'zmanoi. Frank Gemara, adarabba, chut l'mkaimai have a little ukmei b'karis. Let's say that it's not noiser, it's chutz l'mkaimai that the pasuk was talking about, and you learn from chutz l'mkaimai with avoin to chutz l'zmanoi. L'megmar avoin l'chutz l'zmanoi. Guess what? The damalei mem kuf dalachin. There's many similarities between chutz l'zmanoi and chutz l'mkaimai that tumah doesn't share, such as machshava. Both are done by machshava. Pigul of chutz l'zmanoi and pigul of chutz l'mkaimai are done through a machshava. Tumah doesn't come through a machshava. You got to touch it, right? Mem is miktsas. Meaning, I'm sorry, no, kuf, ktsas, meaning the halacha is, if you have to have a whole bunch of pieces of kachim and one piece becomes tomei, the rest don't become tomei. But if you have a whole bunch of little pieces of kachim and one of it became pigul, the whole carbon is pigul. That's another similarity. Dalid, Rashi says, is dam. Dam means that after the zrikas adam, a carbon can never become pigul again. But after the zrikas adam, a carbon can become tomei. And shin is shlishi. Both psukim have the word shlishi in it. The pasuk in Tzav and the pasuk of Kedosh says b'yom shlishi, but a pasuk of Tumah doesn't say the word shlishi. So why don't you say that v'oichel v'avoyne Yisa is referring to the pigul of chutz l'mkaimai, and we have a beautiful gzera shava from chutz l'mkaimai to chutz l'zmanoi to tell us that everybody's chayiv. Ela Amar b'yochanan, we need backup because we got stuck when we tried to pin on Nosar, and we don't have any proof that it's actually Nosar. So we have backup to prove that the pasuk of Yisa is talking about Nosar. Allah Rabbi Yochanan, Tani Zavdi by Levi, or maybe Levi by Zavdi, Osya Kodesh Kodesh. There's a Gzer Shava from the pasuk of Yisa to tell us that we're talking about Nosar. In the pasuk of Yisa, it says Kiyas Kodesh Hashem Chilel v'nichrasa. And in the Parsha of Nosar, the pasuk says, "V'mivoser mibtzai miluyim u'min alechem ad haboker v'sarafta es haNosar beish lo yeyachel ki kodesh hu." So you see the word kodesh here, the word kodesh there. So now we finally anchored one thing down. We know for sure that the pasuk of Oichel of Avoyna Yisa is speaking by Nosar. We know it's more mistaber to compare Nosar to chutz l'zmanoi because it has the similarities of Zayin Beis, and that's how we know that the pigul of chutz l'zmanoi, you learn oven from Nosar to tell you that it's chayiv kares, and the pigul of chutz l'mkaimai is the second pasuk, and there it says va'ichlav avonisa, dafka Nosar gets kares, but the pigul of chutz l'mkaimai doesn't get kares. Beautiful. Ksivacha eskaz Hashem chila v'nichashav ksivaza v'saraftas Nosar beish ma'ala l'Nosar avka Nosar. Gewaltig. And by Nosar the pasuk says, "Dafkin Nosar, if you eat it, you get kares." Beautiful. So now we have everything lined up. The first pasuk of Pigul is talking about chutz l'zmanoi, which we have gzer shava to Nosar. The second pasuk of Pigul is speaking about Pigul of chutz l'mkaimai, which is right by va'oichel v'avoyne Yisa. Va'oichel tells you dafka Nosar gets kares and not the Pigul of chutz l'mkaimai. So far, everything sounds good, and now we're going to throw the next wrench into the gears. Frank the Gemara, umay chazes the kra richa b'chutz l'zmanoi. What makes you so sure that the first pasuk of Pigul is speaking about chutz l'zmanoi? Ushlishi, the parshas kachim tiyu, is speaking about chutz l'mkaimai. Eibachana, maybe it's exactly the opposite. Maybe the parsha of Kedoshim is talking about chutz l'zmanoi, and there the pasuk is va'oichel v'avoyne Yisa, and you don't go.
They're both following Zman.
Oh, very good. Dr. Gemara Mistavra Aricha b'chutz l'zmanoi. The Gemara Avain Minoisar, right? The Domino B'zayin Beis, right? You're going to tell me because it's best to learn the Gzer Shava from. I'll tell you Adarabba. If they're so similar, let's say they're placed one beside the other. Adarabba Aricha b'chutz l'mkaimai u'shlishi d'kadoshim ti b'chutz l'zmanoi mishum d'domilei. That's a good word that they should have been kept together. because they both have similarities, and the Torah wants to tell us an important rule. Don't think because they're similar, they both are Chayiv Kares. You should know Dafke Nosar has a Chayiv Kares and not Chutlas Manon. We should the Damalei Samchay become a Maiklei. So now all we have anchored at this point is that talk about Nosar. We still don't have a good proof which parsha of Pigul is referring to Chutlas Manoi and which one is referring to Chutlam Koimah. So that's still a missing link. El Amarava, forget the second pasuk. I'm a real yeshiva Rosh Yeshiva, and I could fetch, and I could be medayik, and I could extract kol haTorah kula from one word in the pasuk. Mamish kahar matluim b'saira, and I'm going to show you vima learned up a pasuk, vima learned up a Rambam. How I'm a medayik in every word of the pasuk, and I'll get you so many drushes out of it, way more than you even need for this sugya. I'm going to introduce you to a whole bunch of new halachas. I'm going to squeeze it all out of one pasuk. You've never seen a pasuk that's so densely packed with information. Everything I need to know about Pigul, Chutz Manach, Chutz Koimah, Kares, not Kares, and many other halachas, I'm going to learn all out of the first pasuk in Parshas Tzav. Dichsiv. And now we're going to literally go through this pasuk with a fine-tooth comb. I don't know why we ignored the word ve'im, because that's the only word in the parsha that we're not dashed. Hey achel yechel. You know what we learned from that pasuk? Bishnei achilos hakosav v'daber. Pigul applies. Say if I have a machshava to eat the meat of the carbon chutlam komer chutlas manoi, or say if I have in mind to process the meat of the mizbeach chutlas manoi or chutlam komer. Echad achilas adam ve'echad achilas mizbeach. So that's what I learned from Hey achel yechel. The next words are mibisar zevach shlomo. What do I learn from there? Mibisar zevach shlomo. It tells you as follows. Ma shalomim mifaglin umispaglin. Shlomim has components that make pigul, like the dam. If you have kavano by the zrikas adam or by the kabbalah adam, it will be mifagel umispagel. The dvarim that are becoming hutar, the meat, and the emurim, they are the mispagel. They become pigul. Avkol mifaglin umispaglin. Only carbonis that have a mifagel and a mispagel. What if the whole carbon is put onto the mizbeach, like the mincha v'koyin, where there is no part, there's no shirayim? That is not susceptible to the problem of pigul. Okay, shlishi, and the oil there also is because the zrika is mispagel, the meat which you put on the mizbeach.
What did you say it's not?
But a mincha, they don't do anything. See, by the carbon, by a carbon, a regular mincha, you take some, you makam mizbeach, and the shirayim. By the oil of the shirayim, what's the shirayim? The zrika is the mifagel, and putting the meat on the mizbeach is the mispagel. But if by the mincha of a coin, where they don't do a committee, they take the whole thing, put on the mizbeach. So there is nothing that's mat or anything else. So you don't have a mifagel and a mispagel.
There's no zman to it.
There is a mat to it. But
Can't you add
because pigul only applies to something similar to a zevach shlomim that has a mifagel and a mispagel. So that's a new halach we learned.
no other parts?
That's right. That's right. Shlishi, it says b'yom shlishi, right? B'yom shlishi, zeh chutl zman. This is the makar of the pigul of chutl zman. The next word is lo yeratzeh. What does lo yeratzeh tell us? Kartzos kosher. Kain hartos pasuk. A carbon will only retain the psul of pigul if everything else was completed to perfection, and it's a pristine carbon, other than the fact that there was pigul here. Right? We even learned according to Shmuel, even if the carbon is kosher, but you can't eat the basar, right? Even that is not a pristine carbon, and there won't be any pigul on. Take the tzionim take out the vav. Ma hartos kosher achi akrivu komatirav. Just like a kosher carbon is not nisratza until the entire process is complete up to the end of the zrikas adam, so to our tos puzzle, so too for a carbon to have the label of pigul, achi akrivu kol matirav, in every other respect, it has to be pristine, and that's the next Mishnah elaborated upon that. Then the next word in the pasuk is hamakriv. Lo yerotza hamakriv. Hamakriv tells us Hakrava hu nifsal, ve'ein nifshal b'shlishi. Hakrava is referring to the dam. The pigul can occur up until the point where you did the zrikas adam. After that point, if everything is good, the carbon is immune to Pigul. And in it won't become possible with Nosar. We're not talking about the psul of Nosar, which the psul comes later. We're talking about the psul of Pigul, which could only occur up until the end of the Shrika. Then it says Oisoi, because if you think about it, it says that if you read the pasuk, you could be confused because Loye Ratza HaMakriv, the Makriv. We're learning the Makriv means the Zrika Saddam, but the Makriv could also be referring to the person who is Makriv the carbon. So maybe when there's a psul in the carbon, maybe the coin becomes a puzzle. He loses his credentials. Zok Gemara, it says Oisoi, which is an extra word. HaMakriv Oisoi could have said HaMakrivoi. HaMakriv Oisoi means the carbon. So therefore, Bezevach HaKosav Medaber, the Einim Medaber B'Koyin. It's the carbon that comes puzzle with Pigul, not the coin. The next word says Lo Yechashev. So far we're learning all a bunch of random factoids that are very interesting, but we can't lose focus. We're trying to figure out how you know that there's two types of Piguls and you only get chorus if you eat Pigul of Shalab Izmanli. Sometimes I go to a shear and they go through such a long teretz that by the time I finish, I don't even remember the cash anymore, so it's all for effort. But here actually we're going to have a real answer actually. Zog to Gemara, Lo Yechashev. We learn from that is another thing we're going to learn in the Mishnah soon. Lo Ye'arav Boy Machshavas Hacheros. If there is another Machshava Apoisel in this carbon, it will make an Ois Pigul. Now, as far as we know, there is only Machshavas Pigul is the only Machshava that can possible. So what other Machshava could possibly get mixed in here? The teretz is, in a carbon that became possible because of a Machshava Shaloi B'Zmanoi, had it been pristine till the end, it would have been usher to eat with a Chayiv Karis. What if after the Shechita was done with a Machshava of Shaloi B'Zmanoi, you did a Kabbalah with a Machshava of Shaloi B'Koimoi? That's enough to mess up the carbon to the point that it doesn't have anymore the big Pigul. It has what Shaul calls Piglet, right? So it's possible to eat. You're not allowed to eat it, but you won't be chayiv korish if you eat it. So lo yarba machshavas acheres. Pigul. The pasuk goes on and says Pigul. Pigul. What does Pigul mean? This is where the Torah introduces chuslam kaimai. So it's a one-stop shop. We're getting everything we need. We don't need the second pasuk. The Gemara is going to ask you. So now that you got everything out of the one-stop shop, what is the second pasuk for? We'll get there. Yiyah tells you melamed shemistarfin zemzeh, meaning the pigul of chutlas manai and the pigul of chutlam kaimai are going to be b'tzarev. So let's say I had kavana to do half a shear of chutlas manai, half a gazais I'm going to eat chutlas manai, and half a gazais I'm going to eat chutlam kaimai. That also makes pigul. Of course, not with the Chayiv Karis. Then the pasuk goes on. This is going to be a familiar limud. Only one of the two piguls that we've discussed in this pasuk will be subject to the aveira, to the oynish of avoyna yisa. Ve'ezeh zechut l'zmanoi. How do I know that? The gomar avoin min Nosar the domilei bezayin beis. I learn Avon from Nosar. Why? Because Nosar is similar to the pigul of chutz lizmanoi, but Nosar is not similar to the pigul of chutz l'mkoy. So we're all scratching our heads, like what we didn't learn anything new here. Why couldn't Rabbah say this on Amar Aleph? There's one piece that Rabbah was missing. He was missing the anchor that the pasuk of Oichlav Avoyna Yisa is referring to Nosar. This is my fierce phone. I'm going to shut it off because he always leaves it on, and then he goes away, and then no, I'll just shut his phone off. If I shut his phone off, then it won't ring anymore.
It's good to charge.
No, I let it charge, but he has to leave it off because otherwise it stares. So some people will be angry at him that he didn't get their call. So some idiot tool shut my phone. Okay. It's a shtickle lashnar because now that you hear this ring, now you know who all the ringing has been for the last 6 months. Zok Gemara weiter. Did I say that? I was just thinking that. Zok Gemara, lo ye'arav machshavas acheres pigul zechut l'mkoy yiyeh melamed shemistarfin zemzeh v'never shach. Oh, so what was the kasha we just asked? Why couldn't Rabbah think of this earlier? The teretz is Rabbah was missing one piece of information, that the pasuk of Oichlav Avoyna Yisa is referring to Nosar because you have the Gzer Shav of Kodesh Kodesh or Kodesh Kodesh. Before we had that, the Gemara was still busy asking, maybe the Chayiv Kars is talking about Chotum Kodesh. And that's where we got stuck. But once we've introduced that has to be referring to Meiser, referring to Nosar, everything sort of falls back into place. Amalei Rapapal Rafa. L'didach, according to your pshat, the entire second parsha of Pigul, which is in Parshas Kedoshim, is completely redundant because you were able to extract everything we could possibly need to know about Pigul from the pasuk in Tzav. So Shlishi the Parshas Kedoshim to you, my Darshas Bay. What are you going to use it for? So Gemara, Hahumi Boyle Lamokum Sheyehei Mishulish V'Dam V'Basar V'Emur. If you have a machshav of chuslam koimoi, the machshav of chuslam koimoi has to be only to a place where you have dam, basar, and emurim. And Rashi tells us that the machshav of chuslam koimoi had to be for Kaddish and Kalim. You had a machshava to do it out of Yerushalayim. Out of Yerushalayim is exposed. Sometimes you could spritz dam there, and you could eat basar, and you could be makav emurim there. When bisman heter abamais. So only the B'yom Shlishi is not telling us about timing. Shlishi is telling us the Pigul of Chuslam Chaimai only applies if where you hadn't zin to eat it was outside of the Azara for Kodesh Kodshim or outside of Yerushalayim for Kodeshim Kalim. Rashi tells us Lamokim Shemishulish B'dam B'Basar Uveimurim. So Rashi tells us B'dam B'Basar Uveimurim. Hainu chutz lazara b'shas heter abomois. You could be makav dam basar anymore. Zok Rashi lafuke hechel. What about the hechel? Why, if I have in mind to eat the carbon in the hechel, why isn't that Pigul of chutzlam koimoy? You're not supposed to eat the carbon in the hechel. Zok Rashi she'ein boy aktar seimurin v'loy achilas basar. There's no aktar seimurin, nor is there achilas basar in the hechel, and therefore that would not be a chutzlam koimoy. If you had in mind to eat the carbon in the hechel, it wouldn't be chutz l'chaim. Tosfos corrects Rashi, because Rashi is not quite accurate. Because I will agree with Rashi that there is no haktar seimurin in the hechel, and therefore it can't be a place of chutz l'chaim. But there are certain times where they ate the basar of kodesh kodshim in the hechel. And Tosfos says in bad times where Klal Yisrael was surrounded and the enemies were around us and they couldn't eat in their Azara, they actually were able to eat the meat of kodesh kodshim in the hechel itself. Okay, Zok to Gemara Vayter. So that's what you learn from that pasuk. That we learn what the parameters of chutlam koima is. It means outside the Azara. Frank to Gemara. Typically mikrakama. That's what I need. The second sugya, second parsha of Pigul 4 in Kedoshim. I'm a bigger litvak than you. I could squeeze that information out of the first pasuk as well. It says im he'achel yachel. I knew we wouldn't forget that im he'achel yachel. Even the first pasuk uses the word shlishi. It says shlishi there too. So why don't I use the shlishi of Parshas Tzav to learn that the chutlam koimei has to be l'mokim shiyeh mishulish b'dam b'basar v'eimurim? Amar Vashi, I had this question. Risa l'shmaitza kameder of Masna, and I asked him, and he said, Imei Hasam, if I only had the first pasuk, Havamina. Shlishi is a prat, but later on in the pasuk it says Pigul is a klal, and I would have said that's a klal, that's a pratu klal. But that's a klal moisav ala prat. This Rabbi Sharma koimos, and I would have thought that every place could be a place of chuslim koimoi. Kamashalom, the second pasuk in Kedoshim, to tell us that only outside of the zone. So I was scratching my head. If I didn't have the pasuk in Kedoshim, I would have thought Shar Makaimis. Well, what are my options? It's either in the Zar or out of the Zar. So he brings down from somebody the carbon something, the Minchas of Rum, and everybody in Kachim is either Mincha or carbon, or for the Minchas of Rum, that it would only be relevant for Kachim Kalim. Because yes, Kachim can be eaten in the Hechel, but Kachim Kalim cannot be eaten in the Hechel. So I would have thought that if you had in mind chutzlam koimei b'kachim kalim, not to eat it in Yerushalayim, but to eat it in the Hechel, I would have thought that would be Pigul, Kamash Malon, the second Bashlishi, that it's not Pigul unless it's completely out of the Israel. Okay, Tanur out of Yerushalayim. Tanur Rabban. Im he'achel ye'achel bisar zevach shalama. We have other people who darshan these same psukim. Omar Beliezer said, "Kaif aznecha l'shmoya." Listen to what I have to tell you. A beautiful, beautiful pshat in the pasuk. It's worth your while to listen to what I'm about to say. Zok Rabbi Lezer b'mechashiv lechel mizivchai b'yom hashlishi hakasum b'daber. This isn't actually eating nosar. This is actually merely thinking, contemplating eating nosar, or really articulating that I'm planning to eat nosar, which is the psul pigul of chutz l'zmanai. Oy einoi elo ba'oichel mizivchai l'yom hashlishi. No, maybe the pasuk is talking about nosar. Amrit achar shehu kosher. After they did the 4 rikas and there was a kosher or carbon. Now 3 days later, because someone ate it, yachsav yifsar, it's not logical. So we had other svaras that were from a pasuk of lo yerotza, right? But here it's saying it's or actually this would be lo yerotza. It's not mistaber to say that something later on should passel the carbon. Amalei Rebbe Kiva, it's not true. I'm going to give you an example of something that's tar and it becomes retroactively tummy. So maybe eating it later could retroactively make the carbon possible. Hey, matinu bezov v'zava v'shemer yom keneged yom shem becheskes taira. So Rashi either a zav and zava who's counting shiva nekimis day 4, day 5, day becheskes taira. And what happens is if they're soiser, we consider them tummy they lose all their days, all of their tummy. And if it's a shemer yom keneged yom, it's even worse because a shemer yom keneged yom meaning she saw one day a dam when she wasn't supposed to. The halacha she goes to the mikveh, and the next day she's tar. But if any time during the next day she sees dam, it's sois to the tumul mafreya. So it actually, if she touched the keli, was tar. But if later on she sees that tar, now mafreya becomes tummy. So you see this retroactive type of issue. There's a lot of litvish shetayr that Briskerov is all kasha. It's not exactly the same, but that we'll leave that for the Rashi Shir. So Amalei Rabbi Kiva Hemitzin Bezav Bezav Shemesh Javim Keneged Yoim Shein Becheskes Taira Vechiven Shiro Sasru. Yet once they see dam, it's soiser to mafreya. So Afata Altatama Alza Shava Bishahochsher Sheyachsor B'Yivsoil. So therefore, you can't just say standard logic. Amalei, you know what? I have a pasuk. Rabbi Lezer pulled the pasuk out of his pocket. Amalei Arei Oimer. Ha-makriv. The pasuk says ha-makriv, and we learn b'shas ha-krava hu nifsal ve'ini nefsal b'shlishi. This psul could only occur during the akrava. The Torah says, not logic, the Torah says this psul cannot occur later, and therefore it cannot be referring to eating nosar, it's referring to a machshav of chutz l'zman. Oy einoi oimer ha-makriv ela zekoyin ha-makriv. Who said ha-makriv is referring to the shas ha-krava? Who said it's referring to the zrika? Maybe it's referring to the person. A familiar thought that we had already. So if it's talking about the zevach, it's got to be talking about the zrika. If it's talking about the zrika, it must be that the psul is a psul of machshava, of chutz l'zmanoi, but not actually eating it chutz l'zman. Beautiful. But Nazay I need Yosy for something else. So after Benazai tells us what he uses Yosy for, we're going to need to know how he knows that we're not speaking about the kohen. So Benazai Yomer, Ma Tamid Loimer, Levishanemer, Loisa Achar L'Shamla. There's an issue about the Achar, you're not allowed to bring a carbon lake, you have 3 regalim to bring it, otherwise you have problems. Yachal Apma Achar Nidroi, Beloy Yerotza. You might think that if someone waits too long to bring a carbon, now the carbon that he set aside is partial, and he'll have to bring a new carbon. Tamid Loimer, Oisai. Oisai Beloy Yerotza. Only the Itcher Pigul creates a psul in the carbon. Ve'ena Ma'achar Nidroi Beloy Yerotza. Bringing your carbon late does not mean your carbon is possible. We have a third shita. It says lo yechashev. That tells us that we're not talking about nosar, rather b'machshava hu nifsal ve'enoi nifsal b'shlishi. So we have the original svar of Rabbi Elazar that it's logic. How could you say something becomes bad retroactively? We have the lo yechashev, the machshava. We have the lo yeratza. So we have a lot of different ways to know that pigul is pigul, not nosar. Frank the Gemara, Uvenazai the bezevach hakosav medaber. Benazai, who says the bezevach hakosav medaber, the einoi b'koyin, right? He uses Yosy to tell us that loisa acher is not possible. How's he going to know that the possible is talking about the carbon being possible and not talking about the koyin being possible? How does he know that? He could learn it from the same way Acherim learned it. So we had a cherem just a moment ago. So how do you see from there? So Rashi says, we needed a pasuk to tell us that this is not Nosar. We're talking about Pigul. From there alone, you see the person doesn't become possible. Why? Same svar. The Zevachim lama yivsal b'shlishi. The fact that we're even considering that this might be Nosar has to mean we're not talking about the psul on the coin, because there's no reason whatsoever why, if some of Yisrael ate Nosar in 2 days, why that should pass a coin who did that 3 days ago. That's totally illogical. So the mere fact that the Torah needed a pasuk to tell you that we're not referring to Nosar makes it obvious that we can't be referring about a psul on the coin. We have to be referring to about a psul in the meat. Okay? You have the pasuk of lo yerotze, v'lo yerotze zivchahu. The lo yerotze means it's not going to be bavilit. It's referring to the carbon. So if it's referring to the carbon, we know we're talking about a psul in the carbon. Uven azai oisoi v'lo yerotze ve'ein ma'acher nidroi v'lo yerotze. Rabbanazin teaches us that dafka pigul, the carbon's possible, but ma'acher nidroi, the carbon is not possible. You learn that from Yosy. We have another makar to this halacha. We have a makar from Acherem to teach us that the psul bal ta'achar will not pass the carbon. The Tanya we learned Acherem you might think that a makar that you waited till it's past a year old. It's now psul mikdashim, and you can no longer be makabit on the mizbeach. V'yivsal Talmud Loimer. There is a pasuk that combines all of the different karbanos. It says, "V'chalto lefnei Hashem alakecha b'makom yeshivcha l'shak and shemashom meiser degantka tiroshcha v'yitzarecha u'v'charis b'karcha." So we have a hektish from meiser to b'charis, makish b'char l'meiser. Ma meiser ain't an ifshel mishana l'chavrita. We know meiser doesn't become possible from 1 year to the next. Why? Because we know every 3 years there's beer meisers. So you can leave it over from one year to the next, and on the 3rd year you gotta get rid of it. So af b'char, so to b'char ain't no nifshel mishana l'chavrita. So I already have a pasuk that tells you that bringing a carbon late doesn't possible it. So why do I need to say over here? Yes, a bechor, if it's brought late, is not a problem. Because a bechor is not being maratz on the bailam. The bechor is because of the Torah says, I want that it's a carbon. But it's not being mechaper for an aveira, like an oil is for an assay. Maybe if you brought it late, you have a penalty, the carbon becomes possible. So that's on your oisai. But I have another pasuk that tells me that Baal Ta'achar doesn't pass the carbon. It says in the pasuk of Baal Ta'achar, it says and we dash meaning you have an avera, but it will not impact your carbon. Your carbon still remains good. So you have another riot. That's not a problem because for ben azaz limud if you're over on Baal Ta'achar, it will not jeopardize your wife's life. Rashi is speaking about gzela. You stole money, you don't have money to pay back. Or Tosha says it could be referring to the dovis that you're not paying off. How do you know that will cause your wife to die? Because it says Shenemar ein lach l'shalem. It says in the pasuk in Mishli ein lach l'shalem. Lama yikach mishkafcha mitachtecha. Why should we take your bed away? And it's meramis to ishtecha. So zok to Gemara, b'hai oven the Baal Ta'achar nami mesa. I would have thought that if you pay your nedarim late, your wife dies as well. Kamash lon, if you don't pay them, she dies. But if it's late, she doesn't die. So therefore, you need all the psukim. So there's a very famous story. We said it over in nedarim, where there was a man who went to the roof and said, "Ich habe so fand ma Frau, ich will pute werden von ihr. But I can't afford a divorce. Ich will ihr hergeben, was kann ich tun?" So the Rav said, "I have a pasuk eitze." We know the pasuk says that it says Lama yigach mishkafa mitatecha. The city needs a new mikveh. Promise $100,000 to the mikveh, and don't pay, and your wife will die. It's a mikveh. It's not your mikveh. It's mamish gewaltig. So he said, "No, that's a good idea. Ich such sie." He made a big public announcement. Ich such sie $100,000 for the mikveh. Everybody says, "What's like if this heat gefallen from cup? The guy never got a pain stuck in his life. Telling him to pay a shiny eat." But A week goes by, his wife is strong as a horse. A month goes by, 6 months go by, they're bugging him for his donation, but she's strong as a horse. He goes back to the it didn't work, strong as a horse. If your wife dies, that's not a punishment for you, that's a prize. Of course it's not going to work. In order for your wife to die, it has to be a punishment for you that she's going to die. It's only a punishment for you if you love her. So he said, but I don't love her. What am I supposed to do? I hate her. So he said, I'll tell you what to do. Start buying her presents. Start complimenting her, and you can see it'll be more ava. You'll start to love her, and then she'll die because then it's taka, and if you don't pay back, so they start to do this. Be nice to her, and she said, "Sneak fall off and cup. First you're making donations, now you're being nice to me. What's going on over here?" But the relationship started budding, and he liked her, and it became a gavaltic marriage. Now he is afraid. Oh, my wife's gonna die. He wants to know how, but my wife's gonna die. He said, "No problem. I have a push the for you. Pay up." Talk to Gemara weiter. I wonder if that ever happened. So, or if it's just a story that the roof said over. Zog to Gemara weiter. Acher moimim.
Get donation, that's what we should buy. Just give the donation.
Zog to Gemara weiter. Okay. Acher moimim b'machshava hu nifsal be'enoi nifsal b'shlishi. Acher says the machshava of a machshava is chutz l'zmanoi, but not noisa. Rabbi Nosar, who doesn't learn it from Acherim, lo yechashev my ovidly. What does he do with the pasuk that Acherim used? Remember, Rabbi Nosar did it from logic. He said it's not mistaber to say that the noiser later should passel something earlier. So tomorrow he needs lo yechashev to teach us another important halacha. Meboy lo lecharbianai. Yomer bianai minayin l'machshavos. How do you know that one machshava can mess up the other machshava? Meaning, if there's another machshava of psul, it'll mess up the pigul. Shenemer lo yechashev lo ya'ar boy machshava isacherais. Rav Mori Masli, Rav Yadli Minayin lemachashev bechotshim sholaika. Rav Mori used to tell us to teach us a lav. There's a lav if someone has a kavanah pigul. Hamalom lo yechashev. There's an isur lav if you haven't zin a wrong kavanah by the shechita or by any of it. Why would you get malchus for it? It's a lav shein by ma'isuhu. B'chol lav shein by ma'isa ain't loikin the lav. Amalei Rabbi Yehudi the Amar lav shein by ma'isa loikin the lav. There's a famous malchus between Rabbi Yehuda in the sugya of Nosar. It says va Nosar mimenu ad boiker be'eish tisrafu. Rabbi Yehuda said, you know why it says be'eish tisrafu? To make it into a lav anitik lasei. Because if it wasn't for the fact that it was a lav anitik lasei, you get malchus for it. So you see, Nosar. I'm sorry. You get chorus if you get chorus if you eat Nosar, right? But it says loisay siru min ad boiker. There's a lav if you let it become Nosar. Chorus is only if you eat Nosar. The lav you're over is if you knowingly don't do it. That's the machshava pigul. That's the machshava pigul.
Pigul of what?
Either way, either chazmai or I'm sorry? No, you don't get cursed for having the machshava. You get cursed if you eat that meat.
Mm-hmm.
You don't get pigul. You don't get cursed if you make pigul. You get cursed if you eat pigul of chutzas mana. So which is a problem because the kohen there's no skin off his back. Now there's some skin off his back too. He'll get malchus too.
You don't have to eat a chutz l'zman.
Right, I'm telling you, if you eat pigul of chutzas mana, if you eat pigul of chutzas mana, even eat it today, you can't curse. Once this is pigul, the oidish for eating pigul of chutzas mana is curse. It's pigul of chutzas mana, not eating pigul of chutzas mana. No, you get a lot. According to Rav Mori, you get a lot. And Nosar, it says Loishasiru, it's a mafurish lot. But Rabbi Yehuda said, you know why you don't get malchus for leaving Nosar? You don't get malchus because it's a lav nikla say. You don't get malchus, you didn't do anything. Right? You didn't eat it, you didn't dispose of it. So you see from here that the Yehuda holds that a lav shem b'maisa like in a lav.
Can we talk about the monetary compensation from the bottom?
It's garbi. You could sue the kohen.
You can sue the
Yeah, you could absolutely sue the kohen. Zok to Gemara Vayte. They don't think kohen gets scot free. Yeah, don't think they get away with a song.
Yeah.
By duchening. Zok to Gemara Vayte.
If you want to call that as well.
Zehaklal. This is the rule. Kol ha-shoichet, v'ha-makabel, v'ha-mahalach v'ha-zor. These are the four primary avodas. Lechol dovar shedakir lechol, u'lahaktir dovar shedakir lahaktir. So we know this is going to go to the Rabbanon, who hold ein mechashvin me'achilas adam l'achilas mizbeach, right? That's what we had earlier in Shmuel, I think. L'hakta kazayis, chutzlum koimoi is pigul, but it's possible. The imay cars, shall call it piglet, but chutzlum manoi, pigul v'chayav and alav cars. Uvilvad sheyakriv hamatir kemitzvasa. As long as you fulfill the carbon and you do all of its necessary avoidance. Ketzad, let's get into the details. Ketzad karev hamatir kemitzvasa. Shachat b'shtika. He made a proper shchita without any bad kavanas, and then either kibel v'halach v'zarach. He did one of the following three avodas with a machshav of chutz l'zmanai, or sheshachat chutz l'zmanai. The shchita was chutz l'zmanai, but v'kibel v'halach v'zarach b'shtika, and he didn't have a bad machshava by the other avodas. Or sheshachat v'kibel v'halach v'zarach chutz l'zmanai. He had the same machshava of chutz l'zmanai by all of the avodas. Zehu shemakriv amater kemitzvasai, and therefore it's called pigul. And if someone eats this meat, he will be chayiv kars. What's the case of ketzad loy karav amater kemitzvasai? That would be shachat chutzlum koimai. So now already it could never become big pigul because he already passed the carbon. And then kibel b'halach v'zork chutz zmanoi, it doesn't matter anymore. Oy sheshachat chutz zmanoi, and afterwards he did a chutzlum koimai. It doesn't matter if it was before or later. The carbon has to be completed perfectly without any issue in order for it to be pigul. So pigul, even if you had a kavanah pigul the shchita, it's there, but it doesn't grasp and permanently make it pigul until we see the whole avodah be completed properly. If you did all of them chustum koimai, of course, there's no chiv course for that. HaPesach v'achatos sheshachton shaloi l'shma. If a Pesach or Chatos, we know those are the only two karbanos that if you shech them shaloi l'shma, they're possible. V'kibel v'halach v'zor chutz zmanoi, and you did the rest of the avoidance of the machshavas pigul. Again, it's a possible carbon, so there will not be a chiv course of eating that meat. Oy sheshachat chutz zmanoi kibel v'halach v'zor shaloi l'shman. Oy sheshachat v'kibel v'halach v'zor daman shaloi l'shman. These are all examples. Zeu shaloi karav hamadik mitzvasa. Period. Next halach. Lechol kezayis bechutz and kezayis l'mocha. You had kavanah to eat one kezayis chutz l'zmanoi and one kezayis chutz l'mkoimoi, or kezayis l'mochar kezayis bechutz, or kechatzi zayis bechutz and kechatzi zayis l'mochar, or kechatzi zayis l'mochar and then kechatzi zayis l'chutz. Those will all be possible. So the kazayis and combine to make a full kazayis of pigul, like we learned already earlier from Yiyeh, that the pigul of shaloi bizmanoi and shaloi b'mkoimoi will combine, but it's still not pigul with the chiv kares, possible bein kares.
That's only on the Nosar one. What about the first? There was 4 cases.
But as long as any one of the avoidus was done with a psul other than the psul of chutz l'zmanoi, there will be no chiv kares for such a pigul, for eating such a pigul.
Kazayis l'mocha, doesn't that mean chutz l'zmanoi?
Yeah.
So that's a kazayis l'mocha. Why is it?
Because you also had a kavanah of kazayis.
Neutralizes the.
Yeah, if there's any other psul, sure. If there's any other psul in this carbon, you don't compartmentalize the carbon. You don't say this kazayis says this because of that. Remember, we said mixas impacts the whole carbon. So even if you have kavanah pigul on one kazayis, it makes the entire carbon possible.
Agreed.
So if you had a kavanah for one kazayis chutz l'zmanoi and one kazayis chutz l'mkoimoi, that chutz l'mkoimoi spoils the pigul.
Spoils the currents of the pickle.
That's right. It spoils the curse of the pickle. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, I'm telling you, the Malach HaMos goes, damn it, you messed me up. I had it all set up. I wouldn't have had to do a thing. You messed me up, right? Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Zaklal, this is the rule. Kol shemachshevesh hazman, kodma lemachshevesh hamokoim, pigul v'chayav and lav kares. So Rabbi Yehuda is departing from what we're saying now. Rabbi Kiva says, unless the machshava of chutz l'zmanoi comes first, you don't have a problem. If the machshava of chutz l'zmanoi comes first, it will be pigul. As long as all the avodas are done, the machshava of chutz l'mkoimoi that comes later won't mess up the pigul.
Machshava came before the Mizrika or before the Kabbalah.
Correct.
Even so.
That's correct. That's correct. Because you got in your pigul of chutz l'zmanoi, the pigul of chutz l'mkoimoi won't retroactively spoil the pigul of chutz l'zmanoi.
Once you're done, once you're in, you're in.
Right. But the machshavas hamokoim kadma the machshavas hazman. But if you already spoiled the carbon before you had a chance to have the machshavas hazmanoi, possibly bekaris. But the chachamim we share the chacham the whole again. Zev is possibly bekaris, unless even after I made it pigul of chut hazmanoi, if the rest of the carbon doesn't get oishkavir to perfection, then there is no Chayiv of karis. Lechol kechatzi zayis and lahaktu kechatzi zayis. What happens if I had kavanah to eat only a half a gazayis of basar, chut lizmanoi, and to be makdir a half a gazayis of a murim, chut lizmanoi? There, it's going to be kosher because haktara achilas mizbeach and achilas adam don't combine. Chut lizmanoi and chut l'mkoimai combine, but not achilas adam and achilas mizbeach. Jain achila v'aktara mitzarfin. Okay, we'll stop here. So tomorrow we'll learn just once after the Vesikin minyan, right after the 7 o'clock minyan, and then on Shmini Atzeres
6:50.
6:50. Okay, so and the problem is on Shmini Atzeres mincha is going to be early, right? I don't know what time it is. I know for sure mincha is not going to be at 6:15. I know for sure it won't be 6:15. No, I know because it says on the chart 6:15. So it's going to be an hour before mincha. I don't know what time mincha is. Once we know, whenever time we know mincha, what? We can't have kavanah to learn chutz zmanoi or chutz l'mkoimim. We have to learn. We're for sure learning in the same place. Yeah. So we're learning 5 o'clock in Shmini Atzeres. We're going to learn 5 o'clock in Shmini Atzeres. So I want to make sure I don't have a machshavas chutz l'zmanoi. 5 o'clock is the right time. Chutz l'mkoimim, I don't know where we're going to learn.
When do we sell the LDS? We sell the LDS after minutes or before minutes?